Chapter 861. This is how a mermaid princess should be. Floco touched his chin, which was equally blue and smooth as water, more or less, but I'll only escort you away and ensure that the tribunal's wizards temporarily can't track you. The path ahead still needs to be forged by yourselves. After all, mermaids who can't live independently are too disgraceful, better to just die. The mermaids shrank their necks and tails upon hearing this. Looking at the water spirit before them, who wasn't large, but also had a fish tail, they had thought he was one of their own kind. But he wasn't so easy to talk to. Seeing that Aqua had no intention of speaking, Coral stepped forward herself. "My lord, the teleportation array to leave this place is just ahead." She pointed in a direction. Floco didn't waste time. Although he had easily dealt with a veteran third-rank wizard, it didn't mean the current him could fight against a veteran fourth-rank wizard. Lord Water God was still not at full health. The mermaids set off again. This time, with Floco's help, they walked on land as if swimming in water. Water in the air condensed into small droplets, moistening their skin and scales. In just over 2 minutes, they reached the designated location. Arriving beside a withered old tree, Aqua stepped forward and took out a guidance device that Blackfish had given him before the operation. The guidance device looked like a shuttle from a loom, with a circle of miniature magic formations inscribed around its thickest middle section. Magic crystals were also wrapped inside. Aqua activated the guidance device. The withered old tree immediately split open and fell in all directions. After a flash of light, it formed a perfect circular magic formation. Aqua walked in holding Pearl, then inserted the guidance device into the center of the circular formation. 5 people enter each time. The guidance device, without wizard control, had limited power and could only send 5 mermaids away at once. If they encountered an emergency, mermaids who couldn't enter the teleportation had to immediately destroy the guidance device, so pursuers couldn't follow the teleportation array to catch those already teleported. According to the plan, Coral and several weak mermaids would be in the last batch to teleport. Even without pursuers, Coral wouldn't leave but would destroy the guidance device at the end and lead the mermaids to draw away the pursuers' attention. So when Aqua stood on the magic formation and turned back to urge Coral to hurry in as well, Coral hesitated. "Go in." Floco had already seen Coral's intention. "With me here, there's no need for you to sacrifice yourself. Moreover, I guarantee that the tribunal absolutely won't have the mind to track you down next." "Are you going to the tribunal's territory to kill everyone?" Aqua said excitedly. Floco decided to ignore him and continued to the somewhat hesitant Coral. "For mermaids to establish themselves outside, relying solely on some natural abilities won't work. The most important thing is brains. In my opinion, among these mermaids, you have the best mind and strongest willpower. If anyone should survive, it should be you." This was the first time Coral had heard someone recognize her so much, even considering her more important than Aqua. Her lips trembled slightly, not knowing whether from joy or enduring hardship. Ever since Mr. Blackfish told her that to help the atavistic mermaids escape their tragic future, she needed to sacrifice herself by pretending to be infected with disease and accepting wizard experiments. After wizards confirmed that atavistic mermaids were no longer suitable for absorbing pollution from Red Sea tree stems, they would be abandoned and not watched so strictly, giving them a chance to escape. Coral only hesitated for 1 night before telling Mr. Blackfish she was willing. From then on, pain and disease plagued her, and her body was dissected again and again. But as long as she saw her brother's hopeful eyes, she could endure all torture. Yet today, the powerful water spirit lord said she was the hope of the mermaid race. Was she really that important? Was it okay? Seeing Coral still hesitating, Aqua hurriedly called to her. Aqua hadn't known before that Coral would deliberately stay behind, and now he was afraid she still wouldn't want to leave. But Floco had run out of patience. The mermaid called Aqua had ability but was somewhat reckless, while the mermaid called Coral had brains but lacked confidence. These two mermaids were best not separated. Floco waved his hand, and Coral was pushed into the formation by tiny water droplets. The other mermaids quickly followed. "My lord, do you know when Mr. Blackfish will come?" Aqua didn't immediately activate the teleportation array. Just now Mr. Blackfish hadn't come with them, so in his urgency, Aqua could only continue fleeing with everyone according to plan. But now with such a powerful helper appearing, he still hoped the other could also bring Mr. Blackfish along. Mr. Blackfish. Floco thought. Saul didn't mention any blackfish. If there really is one, then this blackfish's identity would be interesting. You take care of yourselves first and escape as many people as possible. He looked at the mermaid Princess Aqua was holding and suddenly reached out to grab her from the magic formation. Aqua was stunned for a moment and instinctively reached out to pull Pearl back, but because the latter moved too quickly, he only grabbed empty air. "My lord, why did you take Princess Pearl away?" Coral also called out anxiously. "I already said that to survive independently outside, brains are very important, and your mermaid princess has long lost this ability. Let her become assistance for your escape instead." The water spirit looked at the confused Pearl and sighed lightly. A mermaid princess, mermaid royalty, shouldn't be like this. As soon as the water spirit finished speaking, his entire being transformed into a blue light and drilled into the mermaid princess's body. Pearl's whole body shook as if electrified, then closed her eyes and opened them again. Her originally pearl-colored pupils were now tinged with water blue. Then she slowly turned around, looked at the still confused mermaids and raised her hand. "You may go." "Princess." Pearl turned again, facing the direction of the Red Sea, no longer looking at the other mermaids. "Today you learn that mermaid royalty has always fought on the front lines and has never been someone who needs others' protection." Then Pearl suddenly flew into the sky, as if leaping into the ocean. With a flick of her cyan fish tail, she became a shadow and disappeared from the forest. The other mermaids didn't even have time to voice their objections. "Sister, what should we do? Mr. Blackfish said that no matter who among us dies here. We must protect Princess Pearl's escape," Aqua asked Coral in panic. "I don't know what to do either." Coral was also very anxious, but she knew that under current circumstances, their thoughts didn't matter, because none of them could bring the mermaid princess back out. Finally, Coral grabbed Aqua. "Let's go." Aqua was stunned, and the other mermaids all looked at Coral. Coral made the difficult decision. "We can't do anything. If we continue staying here, we'll definitely be caught by pursuers. That way, whether it's Mr. Blackfish's sacrifice or that Lord's efforts just now, it would all be wasted." Aqua had long been indoctrinated by Mr. Blackfish about the mermaid princess's revered status. His mind couldn't turn around for a moment, and he still couldn't make up his mind. But when his gaze fell on Coral's messy short hair, his heart suddenly clenched. Thinking of the suffering his sister had endured these days and how she had almost sacrificed herself for them, he unconsciously nodded. "All right." When the mermaids were leaving the southeastern coast, Pearl had already silently arrived at the Red Sea coast. She looked expressionlessly at the increasingly bright sky and the wizards who had begun forming ranks, her heart slightly cold. "Sorry, Saul. The plan needs to change slightly. To make the mermaids escape Nefrit more smoothly, just killing a few third-rank wizards won't do. We need to create some big trouble for them." Pearl's lips curved into a cold smile. "If you want to blame someone, blame them for underestimating mermaid abilities." Pearl's gaze fell below the sea surface. Since you've already been raised to be useless by wizards, then sacrifice yourselves for your true kin. She raised her arms, slowly lifting them above her head, her ethereal voice moaning. Be angry, go mad, is this how the sea should be? Twist, struggle, this world should have been destroyed long ago. Crazy ravings repeated again and again. At the same time, a highly penetrating mental power wave probed into the sea. A few minutes later, the entire Red Sea boiled. Chapter 862, The Mermaid Aberrant. Lord Saul, a wizard ran over and respectfully said to Saul, the black tide has retreated 10 nautical miles. The monitoring wizards have issued a notice that the black tide is over. Do you wish to continue staying here, or return to the Evernight Royal Palace? Saul was completely confused at the moment. Looking at Emperor Alo flying from the sea surface toward the coast, he somewhat doubted the diary's warning. Everything had developed so smoothly. The wizards of Nefrit Continent had once again withstood the black tide's attack. Now the crisis was resolved, and the wizards at sea were gradually returning to the coast, preparing to pack up and go back. Could I have completely misunderstood, and this black tide assault isn't the masquerade ball the diary referred to? Or did having Floco come over cause a change in the predicted future? Just as Saul was wondering whether he should call Sander over to continue his plan, the sea suddenly boiled. Saul immediately pushed aside the wizard standing in front of him, stepped forward 2 paces, and walked to the cliff's edge. The wizard pushed aside by Saul hadn't, yet had time to be surprised when he was frightened by the sea's condition behind him. I'm going to report. He left somewhat anxiously, without even finishing who he was going to report to. The Black Flame Emperor Alo, who had been about to reach shore, immediately stopped and looked down at his feet. The sea surface had become calm after the black tide's retreat, and with the tribunal's control formation still not withdrawn, the sea surface only rippled slightly due to water currents. But now, tiny bubbles were emerging from underwater, rising to the surface and bursting with pops. The bubbles became more numerous and larger, like a pot of boiling water with firewood continuously being added to the furnace below. Saul also came to the sea surface, still over 100 meters from the Black Flame Emperor, looking at the sea surface as well. The seawater temperature hasn't risen. Could it be an earthquake? He scanned the deep sea conditions with his mental power. The nearby Black Flame Emperor had already rushed into the seawater. Not just him, several second-rank wizards on site had also rushed in. This sea area was very close to the Red Sea trees, and absolutely couldn't have problems. Soon, more people gathered on the sea surface. But the first batch to enter the seabed hadn't returned yet, including the Black Flame Emperor. So, although the remaining people were anxious, no one dared to act rashly. The bubbles on the sea surface became increasingly dense, but Saul's mental power scan detected nothing abnormal. No aberrant mental power, no chaotic magical power. Except for unusually vigorous life energy, Saul found almost no noteworthy anomalies. Go down for a look, Saul narrowed his eyes. At this moment, black shadows suddenly rose from the seabed. Those black shadows broke through the sea's restraint at extremely high speed and flew toward the sky. Only then did Saul see clearly that these black shadows were actually the wizards who had just entered the seabed. But their faces now showed complete disbelief. What happened? Other wizards shouted questions. Mermaids, the mermaids have mutated, all mutated. The answering voice actually carried some trembling. Bang! The sea surface suddenly exploded with massive waves, as if a heavy cannonball had fallen into the sea. The spray shot toward the sky. Soon its momentum waned and Wizard Alo emerged from the spray. But what all the other wizards hadn't expected was that this 4th-rank Black Flame Emperor actually showed signs of distress. Saul's gaze focused. Although it was only for an instant, he still discovered flaws in Emperor Elo. The other's mental power had briefly shown a gap, as if a mask covering his face had cracked, revealing a tiny bit of the true face beneath the mask. The Black Flame Emperor before him was indeed Stuart in disguise. Saul temporarily had no energy to think about where the Black Flame Emperor had gone. Presumably, a fourth-rank wizard couldn't possibly disguise himself specifically to deal with him. The defense formation behind him was still flashing. Saul noticed an even larger black shadow rising from the seabed. Thinking of the death warning about Stuart, he immediately rushed forward to Stuart's side at the very front. The underwater situation is unclear. Let's retreat to the back first, Saul said quietly to Stuart. Stuart looked at Saul in surprise, his facial expression almost unable to hold. But he quickly showed an expression of pride mixed with disdain. Since the situation is wrong, naturally I should stand in front. Saul's heart sank. He knew that what Stuart was saying and doing now better fit the Black Flame Emperor's identity. If danger appeared and the fourth-rank wizard ran first, the other wizards participating in the defense war would probably panic as well. The more unexpected situations arose, the more someone needed to maintain order. Stuart was now wearing the Black Flame Emperor's mask and couldn't make morale-damaging moves while wearing that mask. Saul also understood Stuart's thinking and knew that unless he exposed the other's identity on the spot, the other definitely wouldn't leave with him. Should he just watch Stuart die like this? Just then the sea surface finally stopped bubbling, the boiling disappeared, but an extremely powerful oppressive force spread from the seabed. The culprit that had attracted multiple wizards to explore underwater, only to be frightened into fleeing the deep sea, finally appeared. Saul saw the thing emerging from the sea surface and immediately widened his eyes. What is this? What emerged from underwater wasn't the modified mermaid Saul had seen many times before, but a dark giant object whose outline couldn't identify what it was. The giant object's surface seemed covered with a layer of mud that continued to be stripped away by seawater as it emerged. A giant mud monster. The monster, seemingly made of accumulated mud, showed no visible limbs, torso, or head, but Saul could sense extremely vigorous life force from it. Just like what he had sensed when exploring the seabed with mental power earlier. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he never would have thought such mental power came from the mud monster before him. The mud monster was moving, yet no supporting bones or muscles were visible. And although mud kept dripping from its body to the sea surface, its size kept expanding. That's not mud, it's rotting mermaid flesh, Stuart, still performing beside him, quietly told Saul. Rotting mermaid flesh. Such a large volume, could all the mermaids on the seabed be dead? Seemingly afraid Saul might notice problems with his identity, Stuart said nothing more. But if Stuart wouldn't say more, naturally someone else would speak up to inform everyone what had happened. Although Wizard Royer, who was responsible for this area, wasn't present, the tribunal had already absorbed much experience from years of fighting black tides. Almost immediately someone temporarily replaced Royer, becoming the new commander. That was one of the wizards who had previously gone deep underwater. His surprise had been replaced by anger. Using magical power to amplify his voice, he shouted, "This monster is flesh mud formed from a large number of mutated dead mermaid corpses. Their vengeful spirits are curled up inside the flesh mud, obscured by black tide pollution. We can't let it continue developing, or the remaining black tide pollution in the sea will become nourishment to help it grow stronger. Now attack with full force to kill the mermaid aberrant." Chapter 863, The Only Resistance. The wizard in charge of temporary command didn't tell everyone the reason why all the mermaids suddenly mutated and died, But no one was curious right now. Everyone just wanted to deal with this giant monster first. Immediately, the flying wizards around began attacking the massive mermaid aberrant according to previous drills. Only Saul and Stuart frowned, not acting rashly. Saul even instinctively stepped back several meters. Puff puff. Hiss. Various magical effects bloomed on the mermaid aberrant, making sounds of arrows piercing flesh. But strangely, the various magical effects that should have manifested didn't appear. It really was just like purely physical attacks. Mermaid flesh is extremely numb to pollution, and likewise, their reaction to magical power is the same. Saul understood the principle in an instant. Stuart beside him nodded. Before, mermaids still had life, now they don't. Completely mutated creatures were like having started an irreversible chemical reaction. Even death couldn't interrupt this reaction process. And the mutation reaction process mostly didn't require conscious control from the living being. Just like the black tide monsters Saul had helped fight in recent days. Those monsters' behavior of charging toward land was just instinctive reactions of their bodies being carried by the black tide, with cells throughout their bodies having only the consciousness to fight and destroy. More and more flesh and blood emerged from the sea surface, as if a giant stood between heaven and earth. But this giant had no eyes, only a bloated, roughly humanoid outline. The wizards' battle continued. But because Saul and Stuart hadn't yet acted, the other wizards' attacks seemed to have no effect other than adding several hundred holes to the mermaid monstrosity. Some wizards with more powerful magical elemental attributes didn't even create wounds as large as those from more physically oriented attacks. But regardless of wound size, the mermaid aberrant seemed completely unaffected, its volume continuing to grow rapidly. Someone couldn't help but leave the battlefield and come to Saul and the Black Flame Emperor. "My lord, this mutant has low energy, but ordinary magical attacks cannot eliminate it." The other's meaning was clear. They had come for assistance. Saul didn't speak. With Royer absent and Frym maintaining the defense formations of the entire southeastern coast, the highest command authority naturally fell to Stuart as the fourth-rank wizard. Stuart wasn't in a hurry to make a decision, nor did his face show any expression changes that could be read. The mutated mermaid flesh is nearly immune to magical attacks that lack sufficient energy. To break its shell, we need to break through the critical point in one strike. Saul noticed that Stuart seemed to glance at his palm. "You all retreat to shore," he said quietly. The wizard seeking aid showed joy in his eyes. Although not unexpected, the Black Flame Emperor's willingness to act so readily was still exciting. Saul also followed everyone in retreating from the sea surface, returning to the original cliff, quietly watching the Red Sea with only one person remaining. Unlike others' anticipation of watching a fourth-rank wizard act, Saul frowned slightly, thinking, Stuart isn't a fourth-rank wizard, but since he proposed acting at this time, he must have the ability to deploy fourth-rank wizard methods. This should be a trump card the Black Flame Emperor left for Stuart before having him disguise himself. But if he has a trump card bestowed by a fourth-rank wizard, how could Stuart die? Saul felt he seemed to be missing something. The mermaid aberrant monster kept rising, already approaching Stuart's height. Flesh and blood sludge from the seawater continued adhering to its body. Although its body was riddled with holes, its exterior kept thickening, and organs resembling a head gradually formed at the top of the flesh. This mermaid aberration was still gradually taking shape. No one knew what abilities it would possess once fully formed. The best approach was to interrupt it before everything happened. Vast and mighty magical power suddenly rose from the sea surface, accompanied by scorching hot wind. The formation restraining the air seemed to lose its original effect at this moment. Saul's wizard robe flapped loudly in the wind. Under the blazing wind's blast, Saul's skin gradually changed from normal color to gray. This was his body spontaneously resisting radiation from the powerful magic at sea. Definitely fourth-rank magic. Although Saul was blown until his skin ached and his eyes turned red, he still forced himself not to turn away, squinting and seizing this rare opportunity to observe the magical power changes of fourth-rank magic. Emperor Elo should specialize in fire attributes, but on the sea, fire elements would be suppressed by dense water elements. So he's changing form to create physically damaging wind. Fourth-rank wizards naturally weren't confined to elements they specialized in during lower ranks. They could control different magical powers according to environmental needs at any time. Several figures were rapidly approaching from the distance. Those should be third-rank wizards responsible for other areas. They must have heard about the mermaid aberrant and rushed over after the black tide retreated. If their support wasn't needed, they came to watch the excitement. So these newly arrived wizards happened to see Stuart slash downward with one palm, and the violent wind that had been expanding in all directions instantly retreated as if time had reversed. The oncoming wind instantly changed direction. Many wizards who couldn't react in time fell to the ground. Saul also had to step forward to support his body. He still stared intently at Stuart's hand. It seemed like a layer of deep blue flame wrapped around his hand, yet also seemed like nothing was there, just heat distorting the air. The violent wind drawn back followed the direction of his palm slash, transforming into an unstoppable charging giant blade that struck toward the monster composed of flesh and blood sludge on the sea surface. In the blink of an eye, the wind blade fiercely pierced into that massive flesh, tearing it open with sounds of cutting frozen meat, mixed with hissing sounds like air leaking. Stuart's vertical palm slash actually split the 100-meter-tall giant monster from head to sea surface in one strike. Under the fourth-rank wizard's powerful magic, the mermaid aberrant seemed to have no resistance whatsoever and was about to be cleaved in half. However, the air-leaking sounds kept echoing in Saul's ears. Air leaking. There's gas inside the mermaid aberrant. Is it gas produced from the mutation? Saul muttered to himself. He had never seen any mutation that produced gas. But Saul's eyes suddenly widened. He remembered something and loudly warned Stuart, who was preparing to expand his victory, "Be careful, inside the mermaid there's." His words couldn't finish. The split mermaid aberrant suddenly exploded like a punctured balloon with a bang. The explosion carried the mermaid aberrant's flesh and blood sludge, breaking them into tiny fragments that were sent skyward, then fell in all directions like a bloody storm. Even the wizards separated by the coastal defense formation could feel that tremendous impact. The originally glowing coastal defense formation suddenly flickered, its light suddenly dimming considerably. Within that exploded flesh and blood sludge was the massive black tide pollution that had been devoured by the mermaids. That was the pollution devoured by the long-oppressed mermaid race, and also the only resistance that the foolish, suffering, yet weak modified mermaids could make. Stuart. After the flesh and blood rain finished falling, Saul looked toward the sea, but where was Stuart's shadow? Chapter 864, The Return of Monsters. In Saul's view, it was third-rank wizard Stuart who disappeared, but in the eyes of other tribunal wizards, it was the Black Flame Empire's fourth-rank wizard Emperor Elo who had vanished. The significance of these two was completely different. So when the only wizard on the sea surface disappeared after the mermaid aberrant exploded, only Saul dared rush to the sea surface. As soon as he passed through the defense formation in front of the Red Sea trees, Saul smelled a faint bloody scent, but heavier was a light stench mixed with the salty smell of seawater. The flesh and blood sludge from the mermaid aberrant's explosion hadn't finished falling, and the sea surface was continuously being hit with huge splashes. Saul immediately deployed his electric light shield, searching for Stewart's mental power. The explosion just now was beyond his expectations. Its power was so great that it was unimaginable such destruction could be created by mermaids who had been enslaved by the tribunal for decades. Smack! A head-sized fragment happened to fall on Saul's defensive shield, making a sound like shattering glass. It also attracted Saul's attention. He looked up and was shocked to discover that his protective shield had developed a gap from the impact. Although when Saul circulated his magical power, that gap was quickly repaired, it made Saul realize something. The pollution wasn't destroyed by the explosion. It's still in the flesh fragments, and there's quite a lot. Another fragment fell on Saul's protective shield. This piece was larger and nearly pierced through Saul's defensive barrier. Before Saul could react, little algae suddenly emerged from Saul's nape and swallowed the fragment that was about to fall into the defensive shield. Saul quickly checked little algae, "Don't eat random things." But he discovered that little algae was not only fine, but even excited as if it had been supplemented with food. Having tasted the benefits, little algae wanted to drill out of the protective shield to catch other chunks of flesh, but was grabbed by Saul. At this time, Agu in the diary spoke up. Little algae has already undergone transformation from the Black Sea tree source and experienced the black tide outbreak in the Storm Eye. These mermaid aberrant fragments not only cannot pollute it, but because of their rich death energy, have become nutrients for little algae. Herman, so can little algae have a big feast? No, Saul disagreed. This place is full of tribunal informants. If they discover that little algae can devour large amounts of pollution without mutating and even become stronger, that would be troublesome. Bait, exactly. In that case, whether it's Saul or little algae, they would both become their new experimental subjects. Herman, oh my little algae, hide quickly. Although little algae's intelligence wasn't high, it was obedient. Seeing Saul's prohibition, it whooshed back into Saul's nape. Wind Sprite, HMPH, a bunch of cowards. If I had such ability, I'd simply gather a group of people, rebel against the tribunal, and become the master of Nefrit continent myself. The others stopped talking. If this were an ordinary person's world, perhaps powerful resources could become tools for domination. But this was the wizard world, where extremely powerful individuals could turn any resistance by the weak into a joke. Saul currently had no intention of opposing the tribunal. Even if he might in the future, it wasn't with this little capital that he'd dare charge ahead recklessly. He glanced behind him. Fortunately, because others were all shocked by Emperor Elo's disappearance, no one had passed through the defense formation to follow Saul just now, so no one nearby noticed little algae's actions. Putting away little algae, Saul continued using his defensive shield to withstand the flesh and blood sludge falling from the sky. Fortunately, there weren't many fragments in the sky now. Saul circulated his magical power and reached the place where Stewart had just disappeared. He approached the sea surface, continuing to search for Stewart. At this time, other wizards finally reacted. The mermaid aberrant had been killed by Emperor Elo, and they hurriedly caught up to search for the missing person together with Saul. Soon there were many more people nearby. Stewart's figure was naturally not visible in the sky where they could see, but the situation in the sea wasn't optimistic either. The flesh and blood from the mermaid aberrant's explosion had all fallen into the sea. Large chunks kept sinking, stirring up the seawater, and because these flesh and blood fragments all contained black tide pollution, wizards didn't dare use mental power extensively, fearing the pollution would enter their bodies through their mental power. This made the search efficiency even slower. Small pieces of flesh mixed with algae floated on the water surface, making the seawater look like a slaughterhouse pool. Combined with the bloody and foul smell, it was nauseating. Although Saul was the first wizard to arrive here, he never entered below the water surface to search, only continuously scanning the vicinity with mental power. Looking at the sea floating with numerous fragments, he always felt uneasy in his heart. But the diary gave no warning, so obviously even if there were hidden crises, they couldn't affect him. The explosion's impact was strong, but not enough to tear Stewart apart. The most terrifying part was the pollution within. If facing such a powerful black tide without preparation all in an instant, even a third-rank wizard could be polluted. Saul didn't go underwater because he feared what he might find wasn't Stewart, but a mutated Stewart. Just then, the defense formation by the seaside that had been emitting gentle light finally went out. The defense formation stopping meant that the person maintaining it had left their original position. Looks like Frym can't sit still either. Saul felt relieved. Frym is a fourth-rank wizard. Alo and Stewart's disguise shouldn't be able to fool him, but his coming shows he still values Stewart quite highly. Perhaps he'll even enter the seabed to search. Just as Saul relaxed, an anomaly suddenly occurred on the seabed. Several second-rank wizards emerged from the water surface with panic on their faces, continuously flying toward high altitude. The next second, a giant ribbonfish over 30 meters long, completely rotted throughout its body, actually followed them out of the sea and bit the slowest flying wizard. The wizard screamed, and one leg disappeared into the ribbonfish's mouth. The ribbonfish ultimately couldn't fly. After biting off a leg, it fell back into the sea surface, creating huge splashes. Saul quickly flew away from the sea surface, rising directly to nearly 100 meters above sea level. Beside him were many other wizards with lingering fear. Shocked discussions arose. How can there be black tide monsters in the Red Sea? The giant rotting ribbonfish just now was exactly the type of black tide monster they had killed countless numbers of during the past 4 days. But those monsters should have already left with the black tide's retreat. How could there still be ones lurking on the Red Sea seabed? Saul quickly approached one of the wizards who had just escaped. Did you find anyone? What happened on the seabed? That wizard still had residual panic on his face, breathing heavily as he said, "No, but somehow dozens of black tide monster fish swam to the seabed. We didn't discover them at first because our vision was blocked. Only when a first-rank wizard was suddenly bitten in half did we frantically run out." The Red Sea waters were now filled with black tide pollution flowing from the mermaid Aberrant's remains, with concentrations already exceeding safety warning lines. These wizards simply couldn't use magic to fight underwater. Those who could accelerate their escape were all strong individuals with relatively stable spiritual bodies who were little affected by pollution. Hearing this wizard's words, other wizards in the sky also gathered around. What? There are still black tide monsters on the seabed. How did they come back? There's massive pollution in the seawater preventing us from detecting their presence. We can only lure them up to fight. Oh no! A wizard shouted loudly, attracting everyone's attention. The defense formation has been withdrawn. Chapter 865. Where did Frym go? The panicked wizards all looked toward the coast and immediately broke out in cold sweat. Chief Frym believed the black tide had completely retreated, so he withdrew the formation. But who could have imagined that there were still black tide monsters that had separated from the black tide and swum over from underwater? The next second, besides that ribbonfish-like black tide monster, more monsters surfaced. At the same time, the nearby Red Sea tree forest began collapsing in large sections. Black tide monsters had already broken through the original defense formation's position, tearing at the Red Sea tree's trunks and roots, destroying Nefret's final hope against the black tide. No one cared about any missing Black Flame Emperor anymore. Everyone's eyes blazed with fury as they flew toward the Red Sea trees. Not just here. Other areas soon also transmitted information about discovering black tide monsters. Saul quickly joined the battlefield. Various magical lights flashed on the sea surface, but couldn't slow the speed of the Red Sea tree's destruction. Lower-rank wizards couldn't cast magic underwater where pollution exceeded safe levels, while higher-rank wizards were limited in number. Royer was still missing. None of the second ranks present dared command Saul to go underwater. Even for a third-rank wizard, facing so many black tide monsters in the sea was extremely dangerous. Without the concealment of defense formations, the black tide monsters saw the Red Sea trees as a sumptuous feast. They simply wouldn't come up to fight the wizards. Watching the Red Sea tree forest being gnawed with horrific wounds like a sunfish by monsters in the sea, some lower-rank wizards had no choice but to risk pollution and enter underwater combat. Soon people were being polluted, their entire bodies oozing black blood as they floated motionlessly on the sea surface, becoming new flesh and blood sludge. Seeing this scene, Saul finally understood why these black tide monsters had left the retreating tide waves to re-enter the Red Sea. It was precisely these flesh and blood sludges containing massive pollution that caused the Red Sea's pollution levels to rise, attracting those black tide monsters that had originally been leaving. How did the mermaid aberrant appear in the first place? Could the mermaid race have planned from the beginning to turn themselves into pollution in the sea, attracting black tide monsters to take revenge on wizards? Bait, if the mermaid race could easily do this, how could they have been oppressed by tribunal wizards for so many years? Saul's brain spun rapidly. He suddenly remembered that Mermaid Princess Pearl had once called atavistic mermaids ashore by the seaside. Could she also make other mermaids detonate the black tide pollution in their bodies, thus being completely polluted and becoming mermaid aberrants? But Pearl's soul body had long been destroyed. How could she possibly do this? Alfonso. Impossible. Even if Alfonso wanted to release the mermaids, he wouldn't let Pearl destroy the Red Sea trees. Then only Floco, whom Saul had called over. That bastard. I told him to come receive the mermaids, and this guy, fine, he comes to pick them up. But he also drops a nuclear bomb to distract the tribunal wizard's attention. Finally understanding the cause and effect, Saul also realized that there was now no other way to stop the returning black tide monsters, except using force to drive them out of the Red Sea tree forest. The pollution concentration in the seawater is getting higher and higher. More black tide monsters might be attracted. The most important thing now is to restart the defense formation. Strange, hasn't Frym noticed the situation here? Why hasn't he restarted it? Saul didn't understand the defense formation situation and could only grab a nearby second-rank wizard to ask, "How long does it take to restart the defense formation?" The wizard grabbed by Saul answered blankly, "It needs at least 2 hours." 2 hours? Saul looked at the Red Sea trees being destroyed. Send someone to confirm whether the defense formation is being restarted. No matter what, for these 2 hours, we can only tough it out. Okay. The grabbed wizard immediately returned to shore, where they had communication facilities. Seeing the other go to make contact, Saul prepared to dive headfirst into the sea. However, just as he turned around, he saw a figure appear on shore. Saul was startled. It was actually Black Flame Emperor Alo. He was then delighted. If the real fourth-rank wizard Alo had returned, then the coastal defense battle could be much easier. Plus, as long as Frym opened the defense formation within 2 hours, this black tide monster threat would shrink to just a moderately sized black tide assault. The other wizards almost all cheered loudly. Since Wizard Alo had reappeared, He might have just teleported away from the battlefield momentarily. Although it wasn't clear why he only appeared now, as long as he was here, everyone's hearts settled back into their stomachs. Alo didn't disappoint everyone either. He immediately deployed a big move. Without flashy light and shadow effects, everyone's vision suddenly emptied. The seawater near the Red Sea trees actually disappeared in an instant, while the Red Sea trees and nearby wizards and black tide monsters remained, without suffering the slightest harm. Such powerful yet precise control was simply unimaginable. At the same time, an invisible barrier blocked the outside seawater from flooding back in. The Red Sea trees barely stood upright, relying on their dense root systems. Wizards and black tide monsters fell to the seabed. The underwater wizards reacted and immediately took flight again, while the black tide monster fish that relied on buoyancy could only fall to the seabed, jumping and thrashing using muscle power. Not a single mermaid could be seen on the current seabed. It was bare, all bone fragments. Without the obstruction of highly polluted seawater, the tribunal wizards swarmed forward, killing or throwing out the monster fish still destroying the Red Sea trees. The barrier blocking the seawater clearly couldn't hold much longer. Saul quickly commanded little algae to guide the monster fish, while rapidly dismembering enemies with soul blades. However, just after he had dealt with several monster fish, he saw Emperor Alo fly up to him. Have all wizards enter the seabed. Before the defense formation restarts, we can only use manpower to block black tide monsters from entering Red Sea tree range. People can die, but the Red Sea trees cannot fall. Saul was stunned, not understanding why Alo was handing command authority to him. Clearly, he was the person with the highest prestige and strength on site. However, Alo's next words made Saul's heart sink. I'm going back now to restart the defense formation. This place can only be left to you all. Saul immediately understood. The person who has been maintaining the defense formation is you. Alo no longer had his usual arrogance. He frowned, clearly also troubled by the current situation. What about Chief Frim? He has business and isn't here. Alo naturally couldn't tell Saul the inside story. Saul's heart sank again, directly to the bottom. He almost wanted to curse. At such an important time, the tribunal chief actually wasn't here. Saul really wanted to ask, where the hell did he go? Seeing that Saul had recognized the gravity of the situation, Alo didn't want to stay here longer. I'm going back. This place can only rely on you for now. Fine, Saul said almost through gritted teeth. Frim wasn't here, and Royer and Alfonso, who hadn't returned after such a long time since the incident occurred, might have already died as the diary predicted. Now this area really could only rely on Saul, an outsider. Just as Alo was about to teleport away, he paused again. If you find Stewart, please try your best to bring him back alive. You'll earn my gratitude and that of the Black Flame Empire. Saul was first confused, then showed a look of realization. So the person on the sea surface before was always him. The real Black Flame Emperor's face was grim as water as he nodded heavily. This Saul is really clever, Alo thought to himself. Chapter 866, The Sinner. While Saul was cursing inwardly but outwardly righteously taking up the banner of resisting black tide monsters, Frim also discovered the abnormality at the coast. Originally, to conserve energy, he had never been serious, instead resisting Alfonso's attacks with a playful attitude while restraining Alfonso from escaping. But when the massive mermaid aberrant appeared by the seaside, even though their location was some distance from the coast, Frim immediately noticed the anomaly. It was just that Alfonso was simultaneously blocking Frim with desperate determination, which caused him to spend some time trapping Alfonso. However, after dealing with Alfonso, Frim didn't immediately kill him or forcibly search his consciousness, but instead brought the immobilized Alfonso to the seaside. Although his main body was about to leave Nefret, Frym wasn't truly unconcerned about the black tide assault situation. It was precisely because of this that he had semi-forcibly made Wizard Alo replace him in maintaining the defense formations of the entire southeastern coast, and had Stuart disguise himself as Alo to serve as backup. However, when Frym reached the high ground where he could see the coast, he happened to witness Stuart using wind as a blade to split open the 100-meter-tall mermaid aberrant. Frym immediately frowned. With his eyesight, he naturally saw that something was wrong with the mermaid aberrant's condition. The mermaid aberrant's situation was special. When relatively far away, even Frym hadn't discovered the abnormality within it. By the time he saw the mermaid aberrant, Stuart had already completed his final strike. Although Alfonso, enveloped within a ball of light, was severely injured, his consciousness was still relatively clear, so he naturally also saw the situation by the seaside. What is happening? Everything occurring at the seaside was completely outside Alfonso's plans. Although he had spent 10 years making up his mind to let Pearl regain her freedom and live as a true mermaid princess, he would never do anything to harm Nefret Continent. This was his home, the place he had protected for 100 years, struggled for 100 years. If it weren't for Pearl being enslaved and oppressed here with no hope in sight, he wouldn't have created some pollution disease to isolate the atavistic mermaids. Seeing the aberrated mermaids become massive pollution bodies, Alfonso felt a flash of guilt in his heart. But soon, his guilt turned into self-blame and pain. Because what happened next was completely beyond both their expectations. Watching the massive mermaid aberrant explode violently, Frym knew everything was developing in the direction he least wanted to see. Having led the tribunal against black tides for so many years, he had also seen situations where black tide monsters flowed back to return to the coastline. But at that time, Red Sea trees hadn't been planted yet, and pollution cleanup on shore was difficult. So after each black tide retreated, they still had to do a lot of cleanup work to prevent a few preparing to retreat black tide monsters from being attracted back by overly concentrated black tide pollution on the shore. Since Red Sea trees were planted extensively along the southeastern coast, basically no black tide monster backflow had occurred. The lower-rank wizards in the tribunal now had probably forgotten about it almost completely. But Frym, as the chief, wouldn't forget. He looked at Alfonso inside the light sphere and questioned, "Do you want to destroy Nefret?" Alfonso's face was full of confusion at the extreme of terror. He wasn't afraid of fighting black tide monsters head-on, even if they numbered 100 times more than himself. He wasn't even afraid of dying in battle. But he was afraid that all this was caused by his releasing Pearl. He couldn't bear this result. Frym also couldn't accept this result, but he could only force himself to calm down. The warm yellow light sphere kicked out the Alfonso inside, then transformed into human form and stepped on Alfonso's face with one foot, making the latter lie prone facing the sea. Mermaid princesses can control mermaids through mental power. Don't you know this? I destroyed her soul body in advance, yet you released this monster again. Although I don't know how you repaired her soul body, I'm very clear that all of this was caused by you. Alfonso really wanted to tell Frym that he had no method to treat Pearl's soul body at all. But his whole body was trembling, every muscle was no longer under his control, and he simply couldn't speak. Frym let out a long sigh, then bent down to look at Alfonso under his foot. Remember this. If the Red Sea trees are destroyed, you are the tribunal's sinner. If the black tide reaches shore, you are Nefret's sinner. If my journey terminated because of you this time ultimately leads to Gorsa angering the Abyssal Eye, you are the entire wizard world's sinner. Alfonso's eyes widened, and a tear suddenly slid from the corner of his eye, falling into the earth and disappearing. Seeing Alfonso shed tears, Frym felt no emotion in his heart. He only had anger. He had clearly reached Nefret's edge and was about to head to Stat to deal with Gorsa, who was advancing to 4th rank. Who would have thought he would fail at the last moment? Was I too arrogant, assuming Alfonso couldn't possibly escape my control? A trace of doubt appeared in Frym's anger. But he quickly suppressed this doubt in his heart and threw it out of his mind. As tribunal chief, he couldn't have the slightest doubt. Everything he did was correct, verified by the future. Looking at Alo appearing in the distance and Saul taking up the fight against the black tide monsters among the crowd, Frym slowly closed his eyes. Having just suppressed Alfonso, this consciousness fragment's power was already running low. Even if he entered the battlefield now, his effect would be less than a 3rd-rank wizard. Better to concentrate on having his main consciousness return as quickly as possible. As long as he could return to the coast before the Red Sea trees were severely damaged, the losses could be bearable. After a moment, Frym opened his eyes again and lifted his foot from Alfonso. I originally wanted to extract your soul and make you a lonely spirit forever unable to find release in the maze corridor. But considering your hundreds of years of service to the tribunal, I'll give you a chance to die with dignity. There, Saul stood atop the waves, his body rising and falling with the seawater. He was observing wizards from this area taking turns diving underwater to resist the black tide monster fish continuously approaching the Red Sea trees. Originally, Saul, who had taken on the responsibility of defense command, was also supposed to go underwater, but he quickly discovered that most wizards currently had poor combat endurance. Previously, everyone fought on the sea surface. Although they would be hit in the face by great waves stirred up by the black tide, it wasn't as painful as now, constantly fighting in seawater with pollution levels exceeding safety standards. Not only was it difficult to release magical power, but they were also easily polluted. Several wizards, while fighting black tide monsters, nearly mutated and almost ran to the enemy camp. Soon Saul understood that the fundamental reason making this battle extremely difficult was still pollution. He made a decision. He simply wouldn't go underwater and would hand over command duties to others as well. He would just stand at the battlefield center. Whenever a wizard was replaced due to excessively high pollution concentration, they would immediately rush to Saul for treatment. Saul hadn't expected that he, originally invited to treat black tide pollution in mermaids, would ultimately return to his old profession, treating black tide pollution in wizards. Chapter 867, The Role of Reputation. Saul rehung his doctor's license and stood in the middle of the sea, selflessly treating every tribunal wizard. This greatly reduced the wizard mortality rate. Soon, wizards fighting in other defense zones learned of the situation here and specifically sent personnel to bring wizards who were severely polluted and couldn't recover on their own. Over time, even Saul, who could easily clear black tide pollution from others, felt enormous pressure. After all, Saul's treatment actually involved absorbing the black tide pollution from others into his own body, then sealing it in unimportant limbs like fingertips. Absorbing too much black tide pollution in a short time, without being able to discharge, and seal it in time could cause him to faint from overload, just like when he was at the Purity Wizard Tower. Even though he was now a 3rd-rank wizard with incomparable strength to his past self, he couldn't absorb black tide pollution endlessly. But even though Saul was already feeling pressure, he had no intention of stopping treatment. First, this battle was extremely important. Even though he wasn't from Nefret, he didn't want anything to happen to this continent. Second, Saul had originally planned to do something after the black tide retreated. This thing would be very difficult to accomplish with his status as an outsider, but if he had high reputation within the tribunal, it would be easier to get a chance to try. Saul believed that as long as he got this opportunity, he could achieve his goal. Originally, Saul had wanted to stand out and help during the masquerade ball, warned about in his diary, but now he had unexpectedly become a crucial doctor in normal combat. If Saul hadn't done his utmost to treat every polluted wizard, the number of people still able to fight here would be reduced by at least half. Because of this, whether or not they had received his treatment, when wizards looked at Saul, their eyes showed respect. Some even showed the excited expression they displayed when facing the tribunal chief. Feeling the attention from all directions, Saul knew that regardless of this battle's final outcome, his reputation here was already maxed out. No, it was off the charts. But Saul's figure swayed and he nearly sank into the sea, but he gritted his teeth and persisted without falling. At this time, 2 more wizards were brought before Saul. These 2 were in very poor condition, already showing early signs of mutation. Looking at Saul, both showed guilty expressions. These 2 had actually been treated by Saul once before and knew he was also very exhausted now, so they had fought until they could barely hold on before reluctantly coming over. Seeing people approach, Saul's slightly furrowed brow immediately relaxed as he waved to them without hesitation. "Come here." His movements were as decisive as his voice. The 2 wizards didn't dare delay and quickly stepped forward. Saul grabbed both their arms with his left and right hands. Then his fingertips transformed into tentacle-like shapes, extending along their arms to their most polluted areas. At this point, his originally gray semi-transparent tentacles were already close to black and completely opaque. Although Saul was nearly at capacity, his movements treating pollution remained very fast. In less than a minute, the 2 wizards who were about to mutate had basically returned to normal. Saul closed his eyes, withdrew his hands, and only reopened his eyes after 2 minutes. When he opened them, several wizards were still standing before him. "Do you still have any problems?" Saul asked. "No," one lower-rank wizard actively answered, then showed concern. "Lord Saul, are you all right?" "I'm fine. If you've rested well, hurry back. If you don't return, how will others dare to rotate over for treatment?" Saul put on a stern face like a serious commander. But none of the wizards he scolded felt dissatisfied. They had just been concerned about Saul. Since he was fine, they naturally needed to return to battle quickly. Saul was an outsider, and the tribunal hadn't forced him to do treatment work at this time, but he still did it. Although others knew Saul was doing this to prevent the Black Tide from having immeasurable impact on this world, it couldn't stop them from developing trust and respect for Saul in their hearts. Saul squinted, seeing semi-transparent threads emerging from the 2 lower-rank wizards before him, eagerly trying to touch him. 2 easily moved little wizards. Saul chuckled inwardly. Although he had undergone long periods of high-frequency treatment, he hadn't reached his limit yet, but there was no need to deliberately emphasize this point. After sending the others back, Saul took advantage of having no one to treat at the moment to quickly recover his mental power. There was also the absorbed black tide pollution that needed to be transferred and compressed quickly. This could also extend the time he could persist with treatment. But 2 hours, enduring through that would still be somewhat difficult. Despite Saul's treatment, wizards still suffered casualties in battle. Most critically, without the defense formation, quite a few Red Sea trees were still pushed down by black tide monsters or damaged by battle effects. The outermost layer of Red Sea trees had already been thinned by 1 layer, and the damage was continuing. Saul thought for a moment and sent a message to a wizard responsible for communication on shore. "Please call His Majesty Alexandra over." "Call the Evernight Emperor over." The wizard was stunned, but because Saul's prestige was sufficient now, he only hesitated briefly without refusing. "All right, I'll immediately send someone to bring him over. Perhaps the other thought Saul was asking Alexandra to come help the Red Sea trees with his bloodline. After all, the fact that the Evernite emperor used blood to nourish the Red Sea trees wasn't a secret among the tribunal's true wizards. Seeing the other begin acting according to his instructions, Saul calculated in his heart, when Sander arrives, immediately plant Mido. Regardless of this battle's outcome, severe damage to the Red Sea tree forest was basically certain. With the tribunal chief absent and Royer also missing, for the greater good, Saul naturally had to prevent black tide pollution from reaching shore. At this time, no one could stop him, and no one had reason to stop him. However, before Sander appeared, an unexpected person returned. Alfonso, he suddenly emerged from a ball of black mist. Originally, when this ball of black mist approached, everyone was tense for a moment, but seeing Alfonso emerge from within, everyone nearly cheered. At this time, every additional third-rank wizard meant the battle could persist much longer. Although they didn't know where Alfonso had gone before, or how he suddenly returned. As long as he was back, everything was fine. Only Saul felt joy mixed with surprise. Alfonso didn't die. Could my actions have caused a change in his fate? Actually changing the fatal fate of Alfonso and Royer was very difficult, because existences capable of killing third-rank wizards were hard to influence by ordinary butterfly effects. Moreover, using the diary to warn of fatal fates over longer periods often led to situations where you thought you had done something to change the outcome, but actually became an aid to the original ending. Just like Stuart's disappearance, which was very likely caused by Floco, whom Saul had called over. And after so long without appearing, things looked grim. Chapter 868, Alonso. Alfonso. Saul had wanted to approach him, but saw Alfonso merely look at him expressionlessly before transforming into black mist and diving into the seawater. Something's not right with him. Saul naturally wouldn't chase after him to ask, because he had just seen another wizard staggering toward him. Obviously, another patient. Saul quickly changed direction to meet them, thinking, Alfonso's mental state is very poor, but there are no traces of pollution in his magical power. Where did he just go, and what happened? What about Royer? Why didn't he come back together? Could they not have gone to the same place? Saul absent-mindedly treated the newcomer, who was excitedly talking to Saul. Saul, Lord Alfonso has returned. Maybe Lord Royer will return soon too. As long as they come back, there's hope of holding this place. Yes, Saul didn't say much. This place could originally be held, but the cost might be losing most of the Red Sea trees. Now that Alfonso had returned, if Royer could also return alive, perhaps most of the remaining Red Sea trees could be saved. To ultimately end normal combat, the defense formation still needed to light up again. Only then could wizards stop worrying about the Red Sea trees in the sea and lure the black tide monster fish to the surface to kill them. However, after a long time, Royer didn't appear. Everyone's hearts sank again with the continuously collapsing Red Sea trees. Saul once again released a wizard he had finished treating. The latter didn't immediately leave but stayed in place to catch his breath. Now everyone's pollution situation was temporarily controlled thanks to Saul, but because they needed to fully block the black tide monster fish, tribunal wizards couldn't rotate normally in combat, resulting in very high magical power consumption. Even though magic crystals could supplement magical power, the burden on the body was still very heavy. And there was at least another hour before the defense formation restarted. The only good news was that besides their area, although other places also had black tide monster fish flowing back, the numbers weren't as many as here. If they persisted a bit longer, reinforcements should arrive. At this time, Saul noticed that the speed of Red Sea tree collapse seemed to have stopped. Did Alfonso do something? The seawater blocked Saul's mental exploration. He could only vaguely sense an extremely powerful magical power fluctuation. After several breaths, a figure suddenly shot up from underwater. It was Alfonso. His condition was even stranger. The black mist around his body was so dense it seemed to have become solid, and several black tide monster fish were trapped in the mist, being dragged toward a direction away from the Red Sea trees. He had many injuries and severe signs of black tide pollution. But he had no intention of coming to Saul for treatment. Clearly, from previous mermaid experiments, he already knew how skilled Saul was at treating black tide pollution. Yet he kept moving away without looking back. Saul felt something was wrong. He stepped forward 2 paces, but then someone else came for treatment. Saul could only stop, transforming his arm into tentacles to touch the patient's arm while his eyes still watched Alfonso's departing direction. The other was heading toward the deep sea. After the distance exceeded 1,000 meters, Alfonso finally stopped with several black tide monster fish. Saul could clearly see him take out a glass test tube from his body. Inside the tube was a drop of dark red something. It somewhat resembled mermaid royal bloodline. Then Alfonso tilted his head back and swallowed that drop of blood, casually throwing the empty bottle into the sea. Then he took several more potions. Saul hadn't seen those potions before and didn't know what they were for. But his heart was pounding, and a chill rushed through his blood vessels to his entire body. The next second, he saw Alfonso's entire skin crack like peeling wall paint, then fall into the sea. The exposed red muscle under the skin quickly gushed large amounts of fresh blood, but that blood gradually changed from red to dark red, finally becoming black red. Although the blood gushed out, it didn't drip into the sea. It seemed to lose gravity and surrounded Alfonso, gradually changing from a human form to a blob with blurred human outline. Now, even lower-rank wizards without enough experience knew what Alfonso was going to do. Lord Alfonso. A wizard familiar with Alfonso couldn't help but want to rush over, but was stopped by Saul's shout. "Don't go, everyone. Must not approach within 1,000 meters of him. Don't interfere at this time, when he's making such a sacrifice." Saul's voice made everyone stop, showing disbelief on their faces. Then something miraculous happened. Those black tide monster fish attacking the Red Sea trees actually gave up their assault and turned toward Alfonso, who had become a blood mass. The underwater wizards couldn't even find opponents for a moment, and could only surface to look into the distance. Rotting black tide monster fish surfaced one by one, numerous enough to form waves of corpses. Saul also looked down at these monster fish surfacing. So the seabed was hiding so many black tide monsters. No wonder even Alfonso gave up and chose this method. Saul didn't know how Alfonso managed to use his own flesh and blood to attract away the black tide monsters in the sea. This was obviously forbidden knowledge. If used by someone with ulterior motives on land, it could cause sudden attacks by black tide monsters in undefended places. Suddenly, a touch of white mixed with black entered Saul's vision. Disheveled long hair stuck to pale skin, with a cyanfish tail appearing and disappearing. It was actually Pearl, Mermaid Princess Pearl. Why hadn't she left Nefret? Saul raised his hand and flicked it. His arm transformed into semi-transparent tentacles and scooped up Pearl, who had just swum beneath him. As soon as he lowered his head to grab Pearl, he was shocked to discover she had already entered a state of exhaustion. That pale skin didn't shimmer with pearl-like luster, but was as white and shriveled as a dead person. Even having just left the water surface, her skin felt as rough as sand. The cyan scales on her tail were also dull and lifeless. During the process of Saul pulling her up, several scales automatically fell off and dropped into the sea, swallowed by the waves. However, unlike her body's state of approaching life's end, Pearl's soul body had surprisingly been mostly repaired. Perhaps it still couldn't reach normal thinking ability, but at least it wasn't as muddled as before. Pearl seemed to recognize Saul. She grabbed Saul's arm and opened her mouth. Lanzo. She actually spoke. Pearl, who never spoke, actually spoke. Lanzo. Saul knew Pearl wasn't calling him. He looked up toward the distance. The blood figure staying on the sea surface had been pounced on and torn by the later arriving black tide monsters. Gradually, not even a bit of red could be seen. Only dense masses of monsters making crunch-crunch, gnawing sounds. Lanzo. Pearl looked into the distance and reached out her arm. The number of black tide monsters surrounding Alfonso had reached over 100, and more black tide monsters were simultaneously approaching him. Lanzo. Pearl called again, her voice very weak, definitely unable to reach Alfonso's ears. The next moment, the surging black monster mass in the distance suddenly exploded massively. No flames, no sound, only a ball of black mist that suddenly expanded and quickly engulfed the monster groups within 500 to 600 meters. For that instant, Saul couldn't even hear the sound of waves. Lanzo. He only heard a weak voice that couldn't carry 3 meters away, tinged with grief. Chapter 869, Mermaid's Tears. The explosion only lasted an instant, but the aftershocks continued for a long time. Many black tide monster fish still stubbornly swam toward where Alfonso had been after the explosion occurred. But they were immediately swallowed by the exploded black mist and didn't swim out again. Because of Alfonso's sacrifice, the pressure on the defense zone was immediately reduced by more than half, and some wizards who could barely hold on finally had a chance to catch their breath. But Saul knew everything wasn't over yet. Although Alfonso's self-destruction had killed most of the black tide monster fish surrounding him, some on the periphery survived. After the black mist gradually dispersed, they were no longer obsessed with Alfonso and turned back, attracted by the excessive black tide pollution on the Red Sea tree's side. But the enemy density and intensity were somewhat weaker than before. Injured wizards finally had a chance to rest. But Saul never left the Red Sea. He stayed at the very center of the battlefield, still treating pollution for every wizard who came to him. Now countless fate lines from wizards he had treated surrounded him. They joyfully clustered around Saul, appearing very close to him. However, Saul knew these fate lines' influence couldn't enable him to lead the corresponding wizards in rebelling against the tribunal. But at the right time, they could also become Saul's assistants. But observant people had already noticed that, since Alfonso's self-destruction, Saul had only used his left hand to treat everyone. His right hand remained tightly clenched, and he would occasionally look down at his palm. What Saul was looking at was a pearl. Ordinary in appearance, not large enough, not even round enough, but still brilliant and lustrous, not changing its beauty for the world's opinions. This was a tear shed by Mermaid Princess Pearl, which had transformed into a pearl the moment it fell into Saul's palm. The constantly confused Mermaid Princess had tasted the pain of clarity after regaining consciousness. After Alfonso's self-destruction, Pearl let out a cry, shed a tear, then like a candle burned to its end, extinguished her life's flame with a hiss. In the Little Mermaid story Saul had read, she'd ultimately become foam flying toward the sky, but Pearl became black ash falling into the sea. Saul didn't retain the powder between his fingers. This should also be the ending Pearl wanted. After grabbing Pearl, he had already discovered that her body had been possessed by a higher-order existence, and her body had been used for energy manipulation beyond her capacity. This caused Pearl's consciousness to recover considerably, but her body was completely ruined. Even her corpse couldn't be maintained. Only that one tear falling into Saul's palm was probably her last bit of self. But even this bit of self was abandoned by Pearl, along with Alfonso's departure. The diary opened proactively for the first time in a while. Lunar calendar year 321, January 25th, clear weather. Mermaids are spirits of the sea. Mermaid tears are the sea's sighs. Holding the ocean's beloved child. You can become the ocean's friend. Perhaps due to Pearl's special abilities, perhaps her bloodline's specialness, and perhaps also the influence of water god Floco, the pearl in Saul's hand was actually a magical tool recognized by the diary. After reading the diary's introduction, Saul had some guesses about the pearl's abilities in water, but the specific usage methods still needed future experimentation. His mental power swept over it, storing the mermaid's tears in his storage device. This was somewhat difficult. The storage device was, after all, a spatial tool created by a second-rank wizard. After storing the mermaid's tears, the spatial power became unstable. It seemed Saul would need to research how to improve the storage device in the future. Those ancient magical tools didn't have this problem. Their own seals ensured they wouldn't affect ordinary spatial tools. The battle continued, and Saul's treatment work never stopped. After an unknown amount of time, a light suddenly appeared on the battlefield. Everyone's hearts leaped, thinking the defense formation had been restarted. But Saul knew it hadn't been 2 hours yet. He looked up and saw a second sun appear in the sky. The warm yellow sun was bright and warm, dispelling the cold from the deep sea. "It's the chief. The chief has come." Soon others recognized Frym too. Although they weren't clear why Frym, who should be maintaining the formation in the rear, appeared on the front lines. As the tribunal's absolute core figure, his mere appearance gave everyone boundless confidence. Frym didn't reveal his true form but glowed and generated heat like a real sun. Then, without any special attack movements, the black tide monsters that had been attacking wizards in the deep sea turned belly up one by one like dead fish, floating on the sea surface. The wizards below also swam up and finished off the enemies. The light from the second sun in the high sky illuminated very far places. Saul saw large numbers of black tide monsters floating on the sea surface along the southeastern coastline. Those monsters were already dying when they floated up, then were completely killed by other wizards who rushed over. However, despite Frym's intervention, more distant war zones were still being attacked by black tide monsters, and some black tide monsters on the seabed hadn't been illuminated and still required other wizards to dive into the pollution-filled sea to fight. But regardless, Frym alone had almost completed half the coastal wizard's combat work. Truly worthy of a 4th-rank wizard. The real deal. After Frym appeared, another 10+ minutes passed before the defense formation behind them finally lit up again. Everyone breathed a long sigh of relief, then quickly killed the remaining monsters still destroying the Red Sea tree forest before going outside the defense formation to meet the enemy. Although the battle wasn't completely over, everyone knew the crisis had passed. The defense formation separated the black tide monsters from the Red Sea trees and also isolated the super-concentrated pollution near the Red Sea trees. After a while, the monsters that couldn't sense black tide pollution would leave, following the retreating tide back to where they came from. Of course, the seawater pollution inside the defense formation still needed handling. Relying purely on Red Sea trees was too slow, and all the mermaids under the Red Sea trees had died. Without mermaids to take away the Red Sea trees stored black tide pollution stem blocks, the Red Sea trees would eventually vomit out the pollution they had consumed. Looking at the Red Sea trees that had lost nearly 30%, Saul retreated to the cliff. His treatment mission was perfectly complete. His taut nerves relaxed the moment his feet touched the ground. Saul staggered and nearly sat on the ground. But an arm reached out to support him. Saul turned around and was shocked to discover it was actually Royer. However, Saul cleverly transformed his shock into anger. "Where the hell did you go?" Being scolded by Saul, an outsider, Royer wasn't angry. His complexion was also very poor, carrying a terrible pallor, and his whole body was quite unstable. But overall, there was no life-threatening danger. Royer, who was usually cheerful and familiar with everyone, showed a bitter expression. I really died once." Chapter 870, Saul's Solution. "What do you mean?" Saul broke free from Royer's hand and sat down on the ground. He was now so exhausted he just wanted to lie down, but considering his newly earned reputation, he merely sat down rather than being completely undignified. Seeing this, Royer also stopped putting on airs and sat beside Saul. His expression was listless and his mood low. "Alfonso is dead?" he asked in return. "Yes, he attracted most of the black tide monsters and died without leaving a complete corpse," Saul said, then paused. "You also died. Were you resurrected?" Saul remembered that the tribunal didn't allow wizards below second rank to conduct resurrection experiments, but third-rank wizards weren't within this prohibition's scope. "Yes," Royer's mood remained low. "I encountered an unknown fourth-rank wizard and died in confusion. Fortunately, my soul body was stored in, well, telling you won't matter, stored in Lord Frim's maze corridor. After physical death, as long as the soul body isn't polluted and mutated, there's still a chance for resurrection. Originally, I should have accepted punishment for failing to complete Chief Frim's instructions this time. But now with the Red Sea trees lost and destroyed like this, Lord Frim immediately resurrected me to come back and find a solution." "Will Alfonso also be resurrected?" Saul asked this, but knew in his heart it was unlikely. "No." Royer looked at the Red Sea before them and like an ordinary person dejectedly threw a stone. He made a mistake. Being able to die in battle was already the chief showing mercy. Having a good friend of over 100 years become obstinate and ultimately die in battle was actually very painful for Royer too. It was just that after becoming a third-rank wizard, he had grown accustomed to life and death, so his emotions weren't as outwardly expressed as they appeared. However, looking at the Red Sea trees missing nearly half their number, Royer still felt heartache. These were trees he had nurtured for decades. Who would have thought that, while they were hunting atavistic mermaids, the remaining mermaids in the sea would choose collective mutation and death? Now they hadn't found the cause of the mermaid mutation, but Chief Frim believed it was inseparable from the escaped atavistic mermaids. Chief Frim went to investigate the fourth rank who killed Royer, since no one would feel at ease with such an elusive fourth-rank wizard around. Frim pursued the unknown fourth-rank wizard, while Royer had to worry about the Red Sea tree problem. Now there wasn't a single mermaid left in the sea, yet the Red Sea trees continued persistently absorbing the excessive pollution in the seawater. But what should be done with the stem blocks formed after absorbing pollution? In Royer's plan, mermaids were never the most crucial element, but they were an indispensable component. So no matter how Royer experimented on mermaids, he had never imagined that one day Nefrit would lose all its mermaids. After thinking for a while, Royer said, half consulting with Saul and half organizing his own thoughts, "The most important thing now is to quickly deal with the pollution the Red Sea trees will produce this time. If there are no mermaids, using other consumable creatures would also work." Hearing this, Saul asked him, "What creatures currently have high resistance, large numbers, and are easy to handle?" Royer thought for a while. Since the wizard world was sealed, and the advancement path to fifth rank was closed, the entire world species diversity had been rapidly declining. The culprit was naturally wizards. Too many experiments without consideration for recycling or ecological balance ultimately led to mass species extinction. Being able to raise a group of pig-like mermaids was partly thanks to mermaids originally living in the deep sea where they weren't easily caught by wizards. After thinking more, there really weren't any suitable creatures in the short term. Finally, Royer said ruthlessly, "If it really doesn't work, we'll directly use humans." Saul's eyelid twitched. Perhaps because Saul had contributed greatly to protecting the Red Sea trees in battle, Royer now trusted him more and simply laid out his terrible plan completely. "Actually, this plan wasn't something I thought of temporarily, but something the tribunal has always been preparing. If one day the Red Sea trees are lost or pollution gets out of control and can't be absorbed, then we'll activate the Continental Division Plan. It's just that, although Continental Division can temporarily handle this pollution, we still need to find more suitable pollution treatment methods for the future. Otherwise, our defensive war of over 100 years won't be sustainable. We've already persisted for 100 years. Who knows how many more centuries we can continue?" The more Royer spoke, the more dejected he became. Saul didn't ask for details. He felt he might have heard something incredible and immediately began worrying about his situation. "They're telling me such details. Could they be planning to keep me here and not let me leave?" The excuse of treating mermaids obviously no longer held water. After all, there wasn't a single mermaid left here now. Next, would the tribunal let him return? They should, right? After all, the storm eye in the borderland still needed Saul to resolve it. The tribunal could at most detain him for half a year before having to let him go. Currently, besides Saul, no other third-rank wizard could establish a foothold in the borderland, and no one else could seal storm eyes as quickly and with minimal cost as Saul. Saul gazed at the distant Red Sea trees. He needed to make himself more valuable. So it was time to have Sander come over. "Actually, during these days, besides researching mermaids, I've also been thinking about the Red Sea tree problem." Hearing Saul finally join the conversation, Royer's eyes lit up. His making an exception to tell Saul so much was also with the hope that Saul could give him some help or hints. "Actually, there's one species that's very suitable for absorbing pollution stem blocks from Red Sea tree sources. You should know it too." Saul deliberately spoke slowly. "What?" Royer asked urgently. Many terms flashed through his mind, but he couldn't find a suitable one among them. Saul glanced at Royer and hesitated to speak. "Lord Saul, Master Saul, please tell me quickly." Royer seemed to regain his previous liveliness. "Black Sea trees, you're not unfamiliar with them, right?" Royer opened his mouth, then suddenly deflated and sat back down. If the deadly effect of Black Sea trees on Red Sea trees could be solved, we wouldn't have had to clear all of Nefret's Black Sea trees. Seeing Royer's defeated appearance, Saul instead jumped up energetically and said unconvinced, "Just because you can't find a method doesn't mean I can't. Since you know about Black Sea trees, what about inverted trees?" Royer looked up at Saul, who seemed provoked. Of course he knew about inverted trees, extremely rare demonic creatures. If the tribunal hadn't reached an agreement with Baton Academy's third-rank wizard Bate years ago, she wouldn't have been able to take away the inverted tree so easily. Inverted trees were powerful and domineering. They could absorb human souls and control numerous soul puppets. But what did that have to do with Red Sea trees? Red Sea trees didn't have. Wait, Red Sea trees did have consciousness. Compared to plants, they were actually more like animals. It was just that their consciousness was distributed throughout their bodies, so they lacked animals' subjective initiative. Royer, worthy of being one of the tribunal's most important third-rank wizards, actually began to have inspiration after hearing Saul mention two terms. You mean using inverted trees to control Red Sea trees? Then. Saul continued. Use a combination of inverted trees and Black Sea tree sources to give Black Sea trees consciousness to actively control Red Sea trees. Then use the inverted trees' ability to control all Red Sea trees and absorb the pollution within them. The biggest difference between Black Sea trees and Red Sea trees was Black Sea trees had the ability to process pollution. Chapter 871. The Black Branch makes its debut. Royer's eyes lit up as he listened, but soon he realized this idea had flaws. Setting aside how to combine inverted trees with Black Sea trees, this should have a chance of success with multiple experiments. But how would you make Black Sea trees have consciousness to control Red Sea trees? Black Sea trees are fundamentally hostile toward Red Sea trees. Then give it an even stronger consciousness to control the Black Sea tree. Saul wasn't afraid of others learning his method by hearing it. When researching the Black Branch, he had used the diary's cheat methods. Others wanting to conduct so many experiments wouldn't have that much material to squander. Moreover, the Black Branch had a very crucial third main ingredient. That was little algae, or part of it. And now, little algae's composition wasn't simply of the soul-devouring mire anymore. Even Saul couldn't say clearly what all little algae had eaten. So as long as he didn't expose little algae's abilities, he wasn't worried at all that Royer, or even other tribunal wizards, could reverse engineer the Black Branch's formation process. Royer also stood up. He stared at Saul for a long time before saying, "I can see you've been prepared for a long time." He looked at Saul as conspiracy theories began brewing in his mind. He had been prepared for a long time. Was he also prepared for the Red Sea trees being destroyed? If so, was the mermaid mutation also related to him? If the answer was still yes, then when did he start plotting all this? Royer's gaze was uncertain with shock and suspicion. Perhaps his emotions were unstable having just been resurrected, as his face already showed his inner thoughts. Seeing this, Saul had already guessed what Royer was thinking. But he wasn't intimidated at all, because besides calling Floco over, Saul hadn't interfered with anything else. And Saul's communication with Floco was through the secret prismatic channel. Even fourth-rank wizards couldn't possibly know about it. Even if the tribunal investigated Saul, they wouldn't find any evidence even slightly related to him. Of course I've been prepared. I never make unprepared proposals. Saul openly admitted this, as if completely unaware of how far Royer's imagination had gone. He walked to the cliff edge and immediately saw Sander, who had arrived at the rear at some unknown time. Sander hadn't seen Saul on the cliff. Upon arrival, he heard that all the mermaids had mutated into monsters and been slashed and exploded by the Black Flame Emperor in one strike. He had obtained the Emperor's task to use his special bloodline to attract mermaids to gnaw on Red Sea tree root stems. Now with no mermaids, he had no value either. So Sander was currently very anxious. Although he had previously agreed to Saul's experiment, he wasn't a wizard and didn't clearly understand the specific content of Saul's experiments. So he now had no confidence, not knowing whether the Black Branch Saul had made for him and Mido would still be useful without mermaids. Just as his mind was in chaos, he finally saw Saul standing by the cliff edge. His eyes immediately lit up, and his previously unsettled heart became much more stable. Saul waved to Sander, and the wizard who had brought him immediately brought Sander over. Seeing Royer, Sander felt somewhat uncomfortable. Previously, Alfonso had treated him well, but Royer's temperament was unpredictable, sometimes even engaging in humiliating speech and actions toward him. However, this time Royer ignored Sander. His mind was still on the conspiracy Saul might be brewing, with no mood to consider Sander. "Did you bring the branch I gave you?" Saul asked Sander. This was actually something they had agreed upon. Whenever Saul called Sander to the seaside, he must bring the branch. Hearing Saul say this, Sander immediately understood it was time for Mido to appear. He paused for a second, calming his pounding heart. "I carry it with me." Sander took out the black branch, wrapped in a handkerchief from his chest. Before Saul could act, Royer reached out and pulled the branch from Sander's hands. "Is this what you call the experimental product combining inverted trees and Black Sea trees?" Royer carefully examined the black branch in his hands, frowning deeply. "Can this thing achieve the effect you want?" Saul didn't answer, but extended his hand palm up before Royer. Royer, now wary of Saul due to suspicion, awkwardly touched his nose and placed the branch he had snatched from Sander into Saul's hand. Saul took the branch and casually spun it around. Mido's soul had already adapted to life within the black branch and didn't feel uncomfortable from Saul's movement. On the contrary, she was trying hard to convey her joy at seeing him. After confirming the black branch's condition was normal, Saul finally said to Royer, "I'll tell you honestly, this unique experimental product has only passed theoretical verification. If we want to prove it's truly effective on Red Sea trees, we can only conduct practical experiments." Saul swished the branch and pointed at the devastated Red Sea tree forest. "Do you dare let me experiment directly on the Red Sea trees?" Saul's words weren't only heard by Royer, nearby wizards also heard them. Because the battle intensity had decreased, many wizards who had been forcing themselves to continue were now resting on shore. The mermaid deaths weren't secret, and even while resting, these wizards felt heavy-hearted. Hearing Saul's words now, no one immediately voiced opposition. This was the benefit of reputation. Even if people had doubts, they didn't immediately object. Or they were all waiting for Royer to object. Royer's first reaction was naturally disagreement, but thinking of his plan, if there was no other way to absorb the Red Sea tree's pollution, he would have to use his least preferred backup plan. It wasn't that Royer cherished human life, but doing so would easily consume the continent's reproductive foundation. A sharp population decline would affect many things. For example, the replenishment rate of lower-rank wizards wouldn't keep up with the death rate in black tides. So Royer was somewhat hesitant. This matter was no longer something he alone could decide. But if Royer couldn't make the decision, someone could. "Let him try." Frim's voice rang out above them. But when Saul looked up, he saw nothing. The tribunal chief's decisive style was thoroughly demonstrated. Royer, who had just been full of conspiracy theories and hesitation, immediately nodded, "Yes, Chief." Then Royer looked at Saul with a complex expression. "You can conduct the experiment directly here." Then, considering that Saul might not have fully recovered, he quickly added, "Or we can wait until you've rested well before coming together." Saul shook his head. "No need, let's do it now." If they came to experiment in a couple days, would there be so many witnesses? She's already a finished product. Saul looked at the black branch in his hand. "I just need experiments to confirm whether she possesses the abilities she theoretically should have." Then Saul delayed no further. He directly used mental power to unlock the lock sealing the black branch, then aimed at the center of the Red Sea tree forest and threw it directly out. Splash! The black branch didn't touch any Red Sea tree branches. Or rather, the Red Sea trees seemed to have consciousness and actively avoided it. The scene fell quiet. Except for wizards still fighting ahead, almost everyone watched where the black branch had entered the water. 1 minute, 2 minutes. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Half an hour passed. Wizard apprentices were already secretly glancing at Saul on the cliff. Just as they were guessing whether the experiment had failed from the start, the sea suddenly began bubbling heavily again. Amidst the dense boiling like bubbles, a thick black trunk with a diameter of a full meter suddenly emerged from below the sea surface and stabbed directly into the trunk of an intact Red Sea tree. Chapter 872, Mido, third target achieved. A thick black branch emerged from the deep sea and directly pierced into the trunk of a Red Sea tree. The pierced Red Sea tree immediately began trembling, with large numbers of red leaves falling and drifting to the sea surface. Even its crown began to wilt. All these changes were very similar to what happened when Red Sea trees encountered Black Sea trees before. Royer immediately stepped forward several paces, coming to the cliff edge. Small pebbles were kicked by him and fell to the bottom of the cliff. He watched the changes in the Red Sea tree forest intently. If Saul's experiment failed and he couldn't suppress the Red Sea tree's natural fear of Black Sea trees, then he would have to destroy Saul's experimental product at the first opportunity, leaving not even dregs. Otherwise, the Red Sea trees would fall to a chain reaction. That would cause even greater losses. But he couldn't act now. Since he had agreed to let Saul conduct the experiment, he had to give him some time. Let's say, if more than 10 Red Sea trees wither, no, 20 trees. If it exceeds this number, immediately destroy the Black Sea tree. Royer had already redefined the black branch Saul threw out as a Black Sea tree in his mind. This also indicated he wasn't very optimistic about this experiment. At the same time, Saul wasn't as calm and composed as he appeared either. The Black Branch, or rather Mido, was the third target he had chosen for his Symphony of Fate. Unlike before, this time all auxiliary magical formations had been inscribed in advance on that small branch. The core formation was drawn in the spiritual body of Sanders' sister, Mido. Now, Mido would complete her transformation from a weak soul body to a powerful existence controlling an entire Red Sea tree forest. Her fate was about to undergo tremendous change, and Saul would also receive powerful fate force from Mido. Therefore, while Royer watched the Red Sea trees, prepared to humanely destroy Saul's experimental product before losses exceeded his tolerance limit, Saul was also paying attention to Royer's movements. If this guy couldn't keep his composure, then even if it meant falling out, Saul would have to pin him down first. As for the tribunal chief, Saul could only hope this guy would have more patience. After all, he couldn't beat a fourth rank. Under everyone's tense and anxious atmosphere, a second black branch grew out of the water and, like the first, pierced its sharp end into the trunk of an intact Red Sea tree. Then more branches emerged, piercing into more Red Sea trees. The number had long exceeded Royer's bottom line of 20, but Royer didn't stop it. In fact, after carefully observing the first Red Sea tree that was pierced, he walked to Saul's side with a grave expression and stopped observing the other Red Sea trees. "How did you do this?" Royer had already discovered that, although many Red Sea trees had dropped quite a few leaves after being pierced by black branches and appeared much more wilted, these Red Sea trees weren't actually beginning to wither. It was like being beaten up rather than having their throats cut. Their vitality was still very vigorous, and they looked more obedient. Saul didn't answer Royer. Royer wasn't surprised either. He knew Saul hadn't revealed the true secrets of the Black Branch. But not being able to see through it temporarily didn't mean never being able to see through it. Anyway, if Saul's Black Sea tree was successfully planted, it would remain in Nefret from now on. The tribunal didn't lack high-rank wizards, much less research-capable wizards. They might not be able to see through the structure and formula of a new thing immediately, but over the following years or even decades, they would eventually break through. As long as this thing stayed in Nefret, stayed with the tribunal, he would find a way to understand it thoroughly. Because he saw that the Black Sea tree Saul created didn't cause the Red Sea trees to wither, Royer raised his hand to signal other wizards not to act yet. More and more black branches appeared, spreading like vines toward surrounding Red Sea trees, growing more numerous and widespread. When Red Sea trees within a kilometer radius had all been pierced by black branches in their trunks, a protrusion emerged from where the black branch had fallen into the sea. The protrusion was also rapidly growing taller, looking like a large tree's crown that continuously grew new branches, continuing to seek other nearby Red Sea trees it hadn't contacted. The branches growing from the crown weren't numerous, but more branches grew from below the sea surface. Looking from high above, it seemed like large schools of fish were swimming back and forth underwater, with black shadows crisscrossing. In a place no one noticed, a black branch that was spreading suddenly disappeared. The cross-section was clean and smooth, as if someone had cut it directly with a blade. Frym played with the small section of black branch in his hand. From the branch's cross-section, he had already seen much information, but there were still key parts he temporarily couldn't discern. Frym stood in the layered, dizzying dark corridors, looking at the images displayed in the light sphere before him. His gaze ultimately didn't fall on the black branch everyone was focused on, but on that seemingly calm young wizard's face. "Why do you understand so much knowledge about black tides?" Frym cupped his chin, his gaze obscure and unclear, staring intently at Saul's face. "Can't let him return. He has even more value." Saul didn't know that the black branch he created wasn't as interesting as he himself was. At this moment, seeing Mido gradually establishing a foothold in the sea, Saul's confidence in this experiment's success grew stronger. Suddenly, as if some barrier in the dark was broken, large amounts of fate force from the surrounding heaven and earth surged toward him. The third target was achieved. But at the same time, Saul felt this fate force was even more than he had originally calculated. He couldn't care about others, closed his eyes and felt the changes in the fate lines on his body. This large amount of fate force doesn't only come from Mido. There's also Floco. He contributed quite a bit from his side too. Saul slowly opened his eyes, his expression calm. That guy Floco caused quite a lot of trouble coming over this time, but it seems his gains weren't small. At least this mermaid escape also caused changes in his fate. Just don't know if this change is good or bad for him. 2 streams of fate force injected, plus Shea's steady nourishment from his side, Saul felt his spiritual body seemed about to start growing again. For wizards, increasing magical power was manageable. There were multiple ways to achieve it. But improving the soul body was extremely difficult, usually only producing qualitative changes during advancement. But Saul's soul body, due to the special nature of fate force, was actually growing faster than his magical power. He slightly curved his lips, already beginning to ponder the 4th target in his mind. As Saul smiled, new changes occurred in the Red Sea trees on the sea. They were no longer wilted, but instead more spirited than before and grew new red leaves. Royer could no longer restrain himself and flew to a Red Sea tree, testing its condition. The stem blocks under the tree are shrinking. The stored pollution is transferring to the Black Sea tree through the black branches. No, that's no longer a Black Sea tree, but an entirely new species. Royer flew back, looking at Saul with an excited voice. "Saul, you succeeded. The new species you created is absorbing the black tide pollution inside the Red Sea trees." Saul's smile at this moment was naturally understood as happiness about the Black Sea tree's effectiveness. "Your black branch is already a new species. It should have a new designation." "Ah, nomming." Saul frowned. He wasn't good at this but naturally had to keep the nomming rights for himself. "Then let's call it Mido." Chapter 873. Sander returns to the forefront. Mido, Royer had thought of various names, things like Inverted Shadow or Black Sea Core, but Saul had come up with a girl's name. Yes, this name comes from Alexandra's sister. Saul directly brought Sander into the conversation. Royer looked at Sander, his first reaction being contempt, but after thinking about the new Black Sea tree called Mido, he immediately asked Saul, "So when you said you'd give the Black Sea tree consciousness to actively control Red Sea trees, you meant stuffing a human soul inside?" Royer's reaction was as quick as always. Saul nodded. Though Royer had guessed this, he still felt something wasn't right. Even wizards can't stay in non-human bodies for long periods, let alone in a quasi-plant demonic creature. Are you sure this Mido won't quickly mutate? Saul explained. Mido accidentally died when she was just a few years old, and her soul has been imprisoned on the seabed of Blue Water Bay ever since. Under such circumstances, she could maintain her original will without becoming confused, which is enough to prove her soul's specialness. Mido's soul had certain similarities to Kate's. Moreover, in terms of talent, Mido was even stronger than Kate, who was a second-rank wizard. Because she knew nothing about wizard knowledge and had survived purely on instinct. If she could have become a wizard back then, well, there was no point thinking about hypotheticals. Royer was also thinking. He immediately raised the next key question. Even if Mido's soul won't mutate within the new Black Sea tree, can a demonic creature with autonomous consciousness continue absorbing black tide pollution like before? An ordinary soul body definitely couldn't, but Mido is different. Saul again placed his hand on Sander's shoulder, pushing him forward. Mido and Sander are very close. Long before returning to Nefrit Continent, they had already automatically established a soul connection. So now Mido only listens to Sander. Royer's gaze fell on Sander's somewhat nervous face, then shifted to Mido's black branches still expanding on the sea surface. Now Mido had nearly covered his defense zone and was consciously continuing to expand left and right without advancing toward the deep sea. It was clearly under Mido's autonomous control. Royer watched with envious eyes. He knew very well the efficiency with which Black Sea trees processed black tide pollution. If not for that fatal flaw, he would never have abandoned the Black Sea tree cultivation plan. But unexpectedly, after adding a soul inside, the combination of Black Sea tree and inverted tree could grow so large with such wide coverage. If he could control Mido. However, Mido was still in her growth period. Other schemes could wait until she stabilized later. Royer looked at Sander again, this time with less scrutiny and assessment in his gaze and more importance. He suddenly smiled and actively spoke to Sander. "It seems His Majesty Alexandra has given us another surprise." Sander suppressed his inner anxiety. He knew that if he wanted to rely on Mido to return to Everknight's power core, he couldn't always depend on Saul. Whether he, who had a soul connection with Mido, would gain real power in the Everknight royal family or become a nominal puppet again, would depend on his subsequent performance. Although Royer was talking with Sander, other wizards were still watching Mido in the sea. At this point, Mido's expansion speed had slowed. After her trunk emerged from the sea surface, it didn't grow into a towering tree. Its height wasn't even as tall as the surrounding Red Sea trees. But her branches spread very widely. From a distance, she looked like a large net encompassing all nearby Red Sea trees. Other wizards kept monitoring Mido. If any abnormalities appeared, they would immediately act to control the new Black Sea tree and protect the remaining Red Sea trees. But no problems had appeared so far. Their focus of attention shifted to, can this Black Sea tree only grow this big? One wizard stared at Mido's main trunk crown for a long time, then suddenly said, "Why do I feel this isn't a crown?" The wizard beside him watched the black branches in the seawater without blinking. "If it's not a crown, what is it?" "It looks more like roots." "Hiss, it really does look like that, only roots, no branches or leaves. These two wizards didn't know that Mido's composition included inverted tree materials, but through careful observation, they had discovered some essential truths. Seeing that Mido had stopped growing, Saul prepared to return to his temporary palace first. Cultivating Mido wasn't something that could be accomplished overnight. Next, she might need years or even decades to gradually expand her influence over the Red Sea trees. How to accelerate this process, and how to handle other Red Sea trees that didn't have Mido to absorb and process pollution during this period, still required thorough research. Of course, Saul would at most provide general ideas. The subsequent specific work would have to be handed over to the tribunal. He couldn't stay in Nefret for long periods. Now the reason the tribunal had invited him over had disappeared, and the third target of the symphony of fate that Saul wanted to create had been achieved. He needed to think carefully about how to bring up his desire to return to the borderland. Thinking about this, Saul involuntarily yawned. He interrupted Royer and Sanders' conversation. "I'm going back first. I'll leave subsequent observations to you. Also about Stuart. You should know what's going on. I haven't found any trace of him." Stuart might have died as warned in the diary, but with Royer's example precedent, as long as Stuart's soul and consciousness remained, there was still a possibility of resurrection. And what Black Flame Emperor Lo had asked Saul to find might be Stuart's soul. Royer didn't refuse. "We were fighting continuously just now with no way to focus on searching. I'll send people to the sea now." With Royer taking over the continued search for Stuart, Saul hadn't been perfunctory about what he'd promised the Black Flame Emperor. Having completely handed over his work, Saul couldn't care about others' thoughts and directly teleported back to the Evernight Royal Palace, to the temporary palace where he had been living. Now the things he needed to do here were basically complete, and due to resisting the backflowing black tide monsters and treating other wizards, he had gained considerable reputation in Evernight. Now he could be somewhat more presumptuous in this palace. Returning to his residence, Saul threw off his wizard robe and fell directly onto the bed. The best way to relieve mental fatigue was to sleep. After sleeping, he could properly handle matters. Even though Saul was now a third-rank wizard, this remained true. Perhaps only upon reaching fourth rank, when life forms fundamentally differed from humans, could one completely abandon normal sleep. Saul slept deeply and comfortably. Everyone tactfully avoided disturbing him. After an unknown amount of time, Saul opened his eyes and was immediately startled. How was he, lying on the floor of a long, dark corridor? Chapter 874, Imprisonment. Saul got up from the ground and found that nothing was missing from his body. His storage device was still there, and nothing inside had been touched. It was as if he had just sleepwalked while sleeping, and then arrived at this strange place. He walked to the wall and reached out to touch it. The feeling was cold and real. It looked like ordinary painted brick and stone walls. But when Saul tried to explore with mental power, he found his mental power was bounced back. Testing with magical power, his magic was absorbed by the walls with no return. Such domineering walls. Saul didn't rashly attack the walls before him, but walked along the corridor looking for an exit. The corridor here led to a right-angle turn at the end, then continued for the same distance before another right-angle turn. After 4 turns, Saul had actually returned to his original starting point. A square corridor with no entrance and no exit. The walls block mental power detection and magical power. Only the master here should be able to enter and exit freely. I must have been brought in by teleportation magic. It was Frem. Without much thought, Saul had already guessed the culprit who brought him here. "Lord Frem, bringing me here specifically, is there something you need to tell me?" The other finally didn't play word games with Saul. A voice rang out in the corridor, its source indistinguishable, layered like echoes. You stay here for now. Saul frowned. What's the difference between staying here and staying at the Evernight Royal Palace? I won't wander around. Besides, I still have many experiments to do. At the Red Sea, Mido has just been planted and needs careful tending afterward. You're not planning to confine me here, are you? However, Frym didn't respond to Saul again. Saul sighed. Without the other making a move, he didn't even have a chance to counter. There was no day-night cycle here, no time measurement. Staying here, he could only rely on his own condition to keep time. After about 3 hours, a figure walked from around the corner of the square corridor. Only when he walked around the corner did Saul notice the mental power fluctuations he emanated. Before that, the person had seemed non-existent. Was he also suddenly teleported here? The newcomer was a beautiful wizard who looked only 18 or 19 years old, but was already a second-rank wizard. She respectfully walked before Saul and performed a wizard's bow. Lord Saul, my name is Leah. I'm a second-rank wizard specializing in dark attributes. The chief has asked me to serve you here. You can ask me for anything you need. Saul squinted, confirming, Are you sure I can ask you for anything I need? Leah looked up at Saul, her pretty face slightly red. Yes, Lord Saul, any request is fine. Saul crossed his arms. I want to go see Mido. Leah pursed her lips and said pitifully, I'm sorry, Lord Saul, I don't have the ability to let you leave. Saul pursed his lips, knowing in his heart this would be the answer. He raised his hand and a huge pink sofa appeared behind him. He relaxed and leaned against it. Then let me ask you, why did Chief Frym bring me here? When can I leave? Or do I need to pay some price to get out? The more Leah listened, the paler her face became. Finally, she said helplessly, I'm sorry, Lord Saul, I don't know any of these things. Since becoming a true wizard, Saul rarely encountered such timid girls. The last one seemed to be a classmate named Angela during his apprentice period, but that Angela had died very early. This Leah before him could become second rank, so she definitely wouldn't be as weak as she appeared. Then what can you do? Finally hearing a question she could answer, Leah straightened her chest. I can assist you with experiments. You can tell me what materials you need. And although I can't help you leave the maze corridor, if you want to know about the outside world, including Mido, I can help you gather information. Saul interlaced his fingers and placed them on his thighs, thinking about Frym's intentions. Maze corridor. This is the maze corridor, the same maze corridor that once stored Royer's soul and allowed him to be immediately resurrected. But I don't see other people's souls here. Perhaps this place can separate spaces, and I'm being held alone here. When the Black Tide appeared and he was most needed, Frym had Black Flame Emperor Alo take his place, blurring everyone's vision while secretly going elsewhere. Then he returned just before Alo restarted the defense formation. So he must have secretly gone to a very distant place. Otherwise, he wouldn't have appeared only after many Red Sea trees had been destroyed. What he did was very important and needed to be very secretive. He must be avoiding detection by other fourth ranks. What was so important that Frym had to hide it from other fourth ranks? Ophelia was currently researching advancement to 5th rank, but after the Water Gods method failed last time, there probably wouldn't be substantial progress in the short term. Wizard Murphy of the Sighing Wall seemed to have no other ideas and had been leading wizards to resist black tides for years. The frequency of black tide attacks at the Sighing Wall seemed somewhat higher than at Evernight. Frym had no reason to look for him, nor could he destroy facilities resisting black tides. As for the Stargate Council, that was possible. The Tribunal and Stargate Council were currently in confrontation with their own positions, but their views definitely conflicted in places. Perhaps Frym wanted to do something that conflicted with the Stargate Council, which was why he hid his whereabouts. Unfortunately, Saul didn't understand Gorse's recent situation at all, and had no idea what about him had angered Frym, so he never thought of his master. Currently, Saul only thought Frym was going to confront the Stargate Council. Therefore, although imprisoned in this place called the Maze Corridor, he wasn't anxious. "All right, since you can't help me leave either, then go help me organize all information about Mido. I want to continue my research." Saul chose to say this for two reasons. First, to help Mido grow quickly. If she could cover the entire southeastern coast, she would become a crucial figure for the Red Sea trees. And with Sanders' operations, Mido would definitely not become a bullet existence like the mermaids. After all, there was only one Mido, unlike the thousands of mermaids that could be wasted freely. Second, it was also to hint to Frym that he was currently someone who had contributed to the tribunal and Nefret. Whatever the other wanted to do to him, he should weigh it carefully. However, Saul underestimated Frym's determination. On the second day of his confinement in the Maze Corridor, he didn't wait for Leah, who was collecting information outside, but instead heard Frym's voice again. "Saul, I want one of your arms." Saul was currently standing before an experimental table he had taken from his storage device. Hearing Frym's words suddenly, his expression became serious, and he immediately flashed backward. Although he couldn't leave the maze corridor, he had also created temporary coordinates throughout the corridors to facilitate evasion in emergencies. However, when his figure appeared in another corridor, his right arm had completely disappeared. Chapter 875, Wavering Faith. Saul looked down at his right shoulder. The wound was covered with a layer of warm-colored light, and there was no bleeding, of course. He wouldn't bleed easily now anyway. And it didn't hurt either. He just felt his body's center of gravity had changed, making all his movements different from before. Losing an arm wasn't actually a serious injury for Saul. If he wanted, he could even recover instantly. But Saul's heart still wasn't calm. Fortunately, what Frym took was his right arm. If it had been his left arm, then the Storm Eye anchor point and white bone monster fragments hidden in his left fingertips would have been taken. As for his right arm, it mainly contained pollution sources Saul had been collecting. Although also quite important, it at least wasn't as sensitive as the anchor point. Saul raised his left hand to cover the gap where his right arm had been. The warm-colored light slowly disappeared, but Saul's right arm didn't grow back. Saul lowered his hand. The wound was already covered with a layer of new skin. There was no way to replenish magical power here, so Saul simply gave up on repairing his body. It was an attitude of frank defiance. "Since you're bullying me, I'll keep the evidence of your bullying forever. Let everyone see how the tribunal treated its guests." When Leah came around the corridor corner again and saw Saul, she discovered that the wizard before her was missing an arm. Leah was shocked. Her eyes immediately reddened as she ran to Saul. "Lord Saul, your arm, you." Saul turned his head and said expressionlessly, "Your chief Frym borrowed it for use. He probably won't return it to me." Having said this, he turned back to his experimental table, contemplating the few scattered fragmented magic formations on it. Leah clenched her hands tightly, but she couldn't influence Frym's decisions either. She had been sent into the maze corridor to serve Saul not only because of her natural beauty, but also because she had actively fought for it. When Saul had helped wizards clear black tide pollution at the coastline, she had actually been one of them. But during that chaotic battle, after being polluted, her appearance was completely ruined and her whole body was festering. Saul hadn't noticed her as anything but just another ordinary patient, so he had no impression of Leah at all. Leah could become a second-rank wizard naturally through her own scheming and maneuvering, but facing Saul now, most of her emotions were genuine. She was truly grateful that Saul had saved her and many of her friends. So when she said Saul could ask her to do anything, She was even willing to have a more intimate relationship with him. However, Saul made no personal demands of her, only asking her to assist in gathering information and conveying his instructions. This made Leah respect Saul even more and conscientiously do the work he assigned. But she hadn't expected that, after leaving for just one day, she would return to find Saul had lost an arm. She slowly inhaled, her nostrils trembling. Saul still didn't look at her. Leah knew that, as a tribunal wizard, her current identity must make Saul extremely disgusted. Even though for a third-rank wizard, losing an arm wasn't a serious injury and there were many ways to regrow it, this didn't mean the harm didn't exist. At the same time, the humiliation here couldn't be erased just by healing the injury. Unfortunately, their tribunal chief never cared about such things. No one knew what he cared about besides black tides, just like no one knew what the tribunal's judgment orders were really for. Looking at the quietly bowed Saul, Leah felt somewhat heartbroken. She slowly walked to Saul's side, knelt on one knee, and raised her hand to hold the hem of his robe. "Lord Saul, I specialize in dark attribute magic. If you need to replenish magical power or anything else, you can take it from me." Saul turned his head and glanced at Leah, even the kind that's borrowed but never returned. Leah nodded and said, "I'm here to serve you. You can make any request of me." Saul squinted. A thin, faint line emerged from the top of Leah's head, looking at him like a little dog with hopeful eyes. An hour later, Leah staggered away, supporting herself against the wall. After turning the corridor corner, a light door appeared before her. This was how she left, but Saul couldn't see this door. Leah straightened her spirits so outsiders couldn't tell her magical power had been almost completely drained, then walked proudly through the light door. Outside the door, Royer was packing irritably back and forth in the tribunal's conference hall. Seeing Leah, he quickly asked, "How is Saul inside?" Leah shook her head. "Lord Royer, Lord Saul isn't very happy. Besides experimental matters, he doesn't speak much." She handed over the experimental materials about Mido she had gotten from Saul to Royer. Royer received the materials he had been waiting for but didn't leave immediately. Instead, he sat back in the conference hall chair with a pale face. He had only been resurrected for a few days and was still in a weakened state. Although defeating second ranks was no problem, he felt uncomfortable everywhere. Now, with Saul suddenly imprisoned in the maze corridor by Frim, Royer felt even worse. When Saul was invited over, he had known the chief's intentions after semi-forcibly bringing him here. It was to prevent this Saul, who was very skilled at treating pollution, from being called by Gorsa for treatment, keeping someone alive and ruining the chief's plans. But since coming to Evernight, Saul had been very well behaved, cooperating with him and Alfonso in experiments, and even saving so many people when the black tide came. Of course, now Saul's greatest achievement was planting a new Black Sea tree in the Red Sea, Mido. Although Mido's control fell to Sander, an ordinary person, which slightly annoyed Royer, he was happier that the Red Sea trees he had nurtured for decades could continue to survive. Everything Saul had done since coming here made Royer's feelings toward him gradually change from surface enthusiasm to recognition, and finally to almost considering him one of their own. But now, Royer sighed. Alfonso was his friend, a true friend, but his actions would endanger Nefret, so Royer had still reported to Frim immediately after discovering it. Finally, they made a plan to let Alfonso gather all atavistic mermaids for escape, then catch them all in one net. Later, even knowing Alfonso died to atone for his sins, Royer felt only sadness but no regret. But everything Saul had done had helped the tribunal to some degree. Although Royer had suspected conspiracy theories at the time, he quickly realized that Saul, as a third-rank wizard, really didn't have the ability to create mermaid aberrants. In the end, Royer could only consider the unknown fourth-rank wizard who killed him as a trump card Alfonso had thrown out to help mermaids escape, and stopped thinking about Saul. Therefore, Royer found this difficult to handle. Seeing that Royer obviously didn't agree with Chief Frim's imprisonment of Saul either, Leah quietly suggested, "Lord Royer, always relaying information like this might cause oversights in the process. Could it affect Mido's growth?" Royer stood up, holding the materials Leah had just handed him. "I'll go persuade the chief. Actually, even if he doesn't want to release him, there's no need to confine him in the maze corridor." Having said this, Royer strode out of the conference hall, while Leah remained in place, thinking about how to help Saul escape his prison. Chapter 876, Failed Advancement. While people outside were thinking about how to help Saul leave the maze corridor, Saul wasn't relaxing either. After reviewing Mido's growth report, he began wandering the maze corridor again. Hiding in a prison waiting for Frim to kindly release him, or waiting for others to rescue him, wasn't Saul's character. Although on his first day here, Saul had already walked several circles around this square maze corridor without any discoveries. But today, he prepared to take another good look around. Since the maze corridor could absorb magical power and block mental power, it meant this was indeed a place for storing souls. Royer's soul was stored here. Were there other people's souls as well? Saul wanted to look around and see if he could find some natives to gather more information about this place, so he could formulate an escape plan. Saul walked back and forth through the square corridor dozens of times, temporarily finding no gaps where mental power could escape. Remembering that Leah always appeared at corners, he also came to a corner. The walls of two passages formed a right angle here. Even though this sharp right angle before him showed not the slightest gap, it was still the junction of two walls. Perhaps the way out was here. Saul squinted, and a thin line invisible to others extended from his fingertip, then touched the maze corridor's wall. The maze corridor's walls showed no discernible material composition. They felt smooth to touch, like fine powder evenly applied to brick and stone walls. But when Saul's extended fate line touched the wall, it immediately sank into it, completely unblocked or repelled. However, after the fate line entered the wall, it also encountered complete emptiness. The line couldn't detect anything, like entering an ocean with dark currents surging. Even trying to proceed straight was impossible. It could only drift with the flow. The first day's attempt ended when Leah came in to deliver experimental data. But Saul didn't get discouraged. After Leah told Saul about Mido's condition outside, she didn't hurry to leave but knelt on one knee, wanting to provide magical power to Saul again. But Saul waved his left hand, telling her to get up. "What I need now isn't magical power," Saul said after Leah stood up. "I can't stay here forever. Can you help me ask exactly why I'm being kept here?" Leah had actually gotten some news, but her status in the tribunal wasn't high. She couldn't access more secret information and could only rely on her own guesses for many things. "Lord Saul, I heard that after the Black Tide passed, Lord Frim immediately went to find the Black Flame Emperor, and the two seemed to have another argument. But no one knows why they disputed. Could it be related to you?" Thinking of the Black Flame Emperor, Saul's heart stirred. Has Wizard Stuart appeared? Stuart's disappearance was a secret among the tribunal's upper echelons. Even after the Black Tide monsters were completely eliminated, most people didn't know that the person who had impersonated the Black Flame Emperor at sea was Stuart. However, if he hadn't died and was found, he should appear before people now. And even if he had died, as long as his complete soul could be found, Wizard Alo, being fourth rank, should be able to resurrect Stuart just like Frim had resurrected Royer. No, Wizard Stuart hasn't appeared since the Black Tide occurred. Leah shook her head. She didn't understand why Saul was bringing up Stuart. Stuart still hadn't appeared, which meant he hadn't been found yet. The Black Flame Emperor and Frym should be disputing over this matter. After all, having Stuart impersonate Alo was probably Frym's idea too. So could he get some inside information from Emperor Alo? Saul glanced at Leah. Having Leah contact Emperor Alo would be too difficult and too conspicuous. Right now, Leah was the only wizard who could directly contact Saul. Her every move would definitely be monitored. Saul needed a more secretive method to inquire about Frym. The prismatic channel couldn't be connected because Saul was currently in a place where mental power was sealed. Then I must create an opportunity to leave here, even if just briefly. Thinking this, Saul instructed Leah, "Can you see Royer?" Leah nodded. "Lord Royer is often at the Red Sea. Most of the experimental data about Mido that you requested was given to me by Lord Royer." "Good. Go tell Royer to ask Chief Frym on my behalf, no matter what. What does he need me to do before he'll let me leave?" Leah nodded, looking at Saul's empty right arm with some heartache. "My lord, why don't you absorb the magical power from my body? Without elemental particles here, it's troublesome for you to conduct experiments." Saul still refused her. "I currently only need to analyze some data. My current magical power reserves are sufficient. If possible, please bring me some metal formation plates and magic crystals next time." Leah nodded and left reluctantly. After Leah left, Saul produced a small metal nameplate. It was the magical formation from the soul-fixing needle he had gotten from Sander. Previously, to deal with the black tide and modify the black branch that Mido depended on, he hadn't continued studying the magical formation on the soul-fixing needle for a long time. But now he had taken out the nameplate that replicated part of the formation again, devoting most of his time and energy to it. The next day, after sufficient rest, Saul began exploring again. The Fate Line entered the maze corridor, once again like a fish entering the sea, lost and not knowing where to go. However, this time Saul's control over the Fate Line was more skillful. He tried hard to guide it toward more distant places to explore. The world the Fate Line sensed remained unchanged, but Saul believed that if he searched more, he would definitely find abnormalities. That place would likely be Saul's breakthrough point. After all, this was just a 4th-rank wizard's maze corridor. It couldn't be perfect. Finally, after exploring for an unknown duration, Saul finally sensed a trace of abnormal fluctuation. He quickly controlled the Fate Line to swim toward that disturbance. Just as Saul was groping for a way to leave the maze corridor, Frym was in another identical corridor, listening to a subordinate wizard's report. "Wizard Gorsa has failed to advance to 4th rank." The subordinate's voice contained joy. But Frym remained an expressionless, warm-colored light sphere. Failing once when advancing from 3rd rank to 4th rank is very normal. Frym's voice was also very calm. However, his not getting angry at this moment actually indicated his mood wasn't bad. Ever since the mermaid aberrants had attracted backflowing black tide monsters, forcing Frym to abandon his plan to assassinate Gorsa, his mood had been consistently poor. Now things finally weren't developing in the worst direction. Seeing this, the reporting wizard knew Frym was relatively happy and quickly reported the next matter. "However, I heard Gorsa will attempt to break through to 4th rank again within 3 years. Because supposedly, the next major black tide assault from the Sighing Wall will come in 3 years. Frym was silent for a moment before saying, "Tell Wizard Murphy that according to our previous agreement, have Gorsa leave the Sighing Wall for a period." Yes, the wizard responsible for reporting bowed his head deeply. Chapter 877, The Missing Stuart. This is Stuart's soul. Saul was utterly shocked. Having just consumed enormous mental effort to finally get his Fate Line close to the location, emitting abnormal fluctuations, The front end of his fate line had entered a new square corridor. Although he had no eyes from the sensations received, it was identical to the maze corridor Saul was currently in. Even the length of each corridor showed not the slightest difference. The fate line had just stayed here briefly when it detected a familiar soul, or rather a familiar fate force approaching him. He waited a while and discovered the newcomer was actually someone he knew. Stuart. Saul was somewhat surprised and nearly couldn't maintain his fate line that had become thin as an ox hair. How could Stuart's soul be here? Saul intertwined his fate line with the others and found it was indeed the familiar essence he knew. If Stuart is like Royer, having his soul stored with Frym, then why hasn't Frym resurrected him? No, that's not right. Stuart belongs to the Black Flame Empire. Elo couldn't possibly tolerate Frym resurrecting Stuart, unless he doesn't plan to employ Stuart anymore. When resurrecting someone, there are multiple methods to continue controlling that person afterward. So once Stuart went through Frym's resurrection, it would mean the other could very likely secretly control Stuart. Frym also couldn't possibly secretly resurrect Stuart and then send him back. Someone who has just been resurrected is different from someone who is severely injured. Royer's abnormality had been very obvious back then. Since Saul had seen a freshly resurrected person for the first time, next time he would be able to recognize what state a newly resurrected person was in. Frym had clearly found Stuart's soul, but hadn't given it to Elo for resurrection. He must be hiding something from Elo. Internal troubles within the tribunal can also be exploited. Such a massive organization couldn't possibly be united as one. Saul, currently trapped in this iron cage, could only look for cracks within it. Saul tried to get Stuart's attention, but found he had no reaction. He wandered the square corridor like a confused zombie. Stuart's condition is wrong. When Saul discovered this, his fate line finally couldn't hold on and could only slowly withdraw from the other side. He collapsed somewhat exhaustedly onto his pink soft sofa, looking up at the deep darkness above the ceilingless corridor. Stuart seems to have had his consciousness forcibly plundered. What is Frym's purpose in treating Stuart this way? Saul's hand kept tapping the sofa armrest. Frym won't also plunder my consciousness, will he? If this really happened, Saul could temporarily only rely on the diary to evade Frym's exploration of his mental world. As for using the consciousness platform to counterattack Frym, he had never even considered it. Even Ophelia, the weakest among fourth ranks, could easily leave Saul's consciousness platform. Frym would be even less affected. That would instead easily expose Saul's secrets. However, Saul could use the diary to cover his secrets. Thinking of this, Saul immediately began preparations. Although he had found a useless Stuart, it also let Saul know what aspects he should guard against regarding Frym. At least it wasn't entirely fruitless. As Saul continued plotting to leave the maze corridor in the far north of Stat Continent, outside the Sighing Wall, fourth-rank Wizard Murphy teleported to outside a remote, secluded wizard tower. When his figure appeared, a wizard apprentice immediately emerged from the wizard tower. Lord Murphy, Haywood bowed respectfully, but his face showed great difficulty. Lord Gorsa says he is in deep meditation, recovering from his injuries, and cannot come out for a short time. This was clearly refusing to see visitors. Having a third-rank wizard make a wizard apprentice say this to a fourth-rank wizard. If it were anyone else, they could simply be scolded as ungrateful. But the other party was Gorsa. Murphy could only sigh. He was used to it. I know Gorsa might not be in a good mood right now. No one would be in a good mood after failing advancement, even for the extremely difficult third to fourth transition. Presumably, given Gorsa's pride, he couldn't accept his failure. However, Murphy still needed to see Gorsa. Tell your lord that Saul is currently imprisoned by the tribunal, and they very likely came for him." Haywood looked up in shock, meeting Murphy's calm but emotional gaze. Saul, why would the tribunal imprison Saul? Although Saul was now a third-rank wizard, a height unreachable for Haywood, an apprentice with no hope of becoming a true wizard, Haywood still couldn't help but worry about Saul. After all, he knew very well how much Gorsa valued Saul. Murphy didn't answer Haywood's question. Even though he was a universally recognized brave and great fourth-rank wizard and the most important pillar of the Sighing Wall, he wouldn't easily answer a wizard apprentice's doubts. Haywood immediately realized his presumption and hurried back to report this matter to Gorsa. Who would have thought Gorsa still had no intention of coming out to see Murphy? After a moment, Haywood emerged with an even more embarrassed expression than before. "Lord Murphy, I'm very sorry. Master Gorsa is currently in very poor condition and cannot come out to see you." Murphy frowned slightly. Haywood continued, "Also, he asked me to tell you that regarding Saul's matter, let him handle it himself. The master said he isn't Saul's father." This statement was quite impolite. Although the original meaning referred to Saul, it was also very offensive to Murphy, who was delivering the message. Fortunately, Murphy didn't get angry. He just shook his head and left his final words. "Very well, but tell Gorsa that not everyone can tolerate his willfulness. Also, don't shut yourself away after advancement failure. I can give him a year's leave to go out and see the world. Just staying in the Wizard Tower will cause him to miss much knowledge." Having said this, Wizard Murphy's figure disappeared. Haywood's form deflated, and he nearly sat on the ground. Although Wizard Murphy had shown no obvious emotional changes just now, his overall presence still made Haywood's brain feel ready to explode. He quickly returned to Gorsa's Wizard Tower, finally feeling much more comfortable. Then looking up, he saw Gorsa. This Gorsa, who should have been in a bad mood with a strange temper, was currently tilting his head with a smile on his face. "Master," Haywood quickly lowered his head. In recent years, he had become increasingly afraid to look directly at his master. Perhaps Murphy was right. Gorsa wasn't his master, but his lord. "I don't need others' tolerance." Gorsa's voice came with a smile. "But Murphy is right. I should go out and walk around. Just staying in the Wizard Tower will cause me to miss many things." Chapter 878, Precious Lab Rat Saul. After leaving Gorsa's Wizard Tower, Wizard Murphy appeared high up on the Sighing Wall. "Lord Murphy! Lord Murphy!" Passing patrol wizards all respectfully bowed to Murphy. They bowed with fervor and sincerity, looking at this great wizard who had selflessly dedicated over 100 years to Stat Continent. Wizard Murphy hadn't established wizard forces like Frim and Alec, always leading wizards to resist black tides. This had protected Stat Continent's peace for so many years. So regardless of which faction they belonged to, wizards were very respectful toward Wizard Murphy. Murphy paid no attention to these wizards, only quietly gazing at the distant sea. A black tide had just passed, and the Sighing Wall had lost quite a few wizards. Fortunately, this black tide's intensity wasn't high, so their losses were still within acceptable limits. Current lower-rank wizards grow too slowly. Someone was discussing in the distance. They hadn't seen Murphy, but Murphy could clearly hear their voices. Another wizard tower has become vacant, but no new third-rank wizards have come to report. In my opinion, we should implement the advancement pathway law again. Those who can't advance shouldn't continue wasting our resources. Forcibly make those who haven't advanced to third-level apprentice by age 30, and those who haven't become true wizards by age 50, into cornerstones of the Sighing Wall. Cornerstones were just a nicer name for cannon fodder. The one saying this was a first-rank wizard. If it were a second-rank wizard, they would have added, if you haven't become a second-rank wizard by a certain age and such words. Murphy chuckled softly and shook his head. All such willful fellows. He looked at the sea, where several ugly and bizarre large birds soared above the surface, preparing to pick at meat scraps for dinner. Why can't I be willful for once? Murphy murmured. Gorsa hadn't stayed at the Sighing Wall long. After hearing Murphy's suggestion, he left alone. His only conscience was probably bringing the Haywood siblings back inside the Sighing Wall, to prevent them from dying in monster invasions. The wizards of the Sighing Wall watched Gorsa's departing figure, not knowing where he was going, but before leaving, Gorsa had said he would return within 3 years and participate in the next Black Tide assault as scheduled. It was because of his promise that no one stepped forward to stop Gorsa from leaving. The Sighing Wall wizards didn't know where Gorsa would go, but some people were very clear. Murphy was one who knew. 2 days ago, Gorsa had received a letter. Although Murphy hadn't seen that letter, he knew its contents. Saul put away the parchment and looked again at the metal nameplate on his experimental table. He had just analyzed another part of the soul-fixing needle's magic formation and gained some understanding of how the soul-fixing needle worked. This method can indeed help pull people back from the edge of mutation, but it's too domineering in use. It would probably drive people crazy for a while. Whether they can be saved afterward depends on the person's spiritual body strength. Suddenly, a completely unconcealed mental power fluctuation came from around the corridor corner. That fluctuation was domineering, powerful, and carried extremely strong aggression. Saul immediately put away all the metal nameplates in his hands and stood up. Chief Frim. After half a month, Saul finally saw the culprit who had imprisoned him. The other wasn't currently in the form of a warm yellow light sphere, but a middle-aged man with skin so pale he looked like a dead person. Tall and expressionless, with golden medium-length hair softly pressed against his face. He looked like a rigid, serious, aristocratic gentleman. He walked before Saul and said straightforwardly, "How did you seal the Storm Eye?" The ice lock magic for sealing Storm Eyes should have already been submitted to you. Ice lock can seal Storm Eyes but cannot save people already mutated by Black Tides. You were overflowing with Black Tide back then. The Storm Eye must have been inside your body. How did you survive? Many wizards present had indeed seen this at the time, but no one pursued it afterward. After all, Saul had relied on himself to become third rank, owed nothing to the other 2 factions, and had even saved other wizards. And because Flame Lord, Wind Sprite, and Dreammaker, 3 third ranks, had successively disappeared, Saul was top-tier strength in the borderland, and no one dared say anything. But this didn't mean Frim hadn't noticed this matter. Saul also understood that the other had kept him here so long as a show of force, so that when asking the current question, Saul wouldn't think he could casually brush it off. But today, Frim didn't even have the patience to listen to Saul's explanation. "You don't need to say anything, I'll see for myself." He grabbed Saul's left arm, making Saul, who only had one arm left, tighten his heart. But he didn't take away another of Saul's arms. Instead, his figure flashed, and the entire square corridor suddenly became flat parchment, then began folding diagonally. Saul and Frim inside the corridor also seemed to become paper figures folded within. Saul naturally couldn't see what the outside world had become. In his perception, heaven and earth seemed to lose all light in an instant. When he opened his eyes again, he was already standing suspended with Frim above turbulent seas. At this time, Frim had once again become a warm yellow light sphere, while Saul was in the middle of the light sphere, like a small insect trapped in amber. The 2 appeared above the sea, then continued proceeding southeast. The light sphere looked round and plump, but flew very fast. Empty islands and monsters, whose original forms were unrecognizable, flashed beneath Saul's feet. Saul hadn't been here before, but the black tide aura in these waters was much denser than near Nefret's coast. The seawater was also deep blue, with several shadows within the deep blue. Saul calculated the distance and time, realizing he had gone deep into the ocean. Combining this with what Frem had just said, the other probably wanted to find some black tide to test his abilities. But testing like this made even Saul feel panicked. If Frem just threw him into ordinary black tide, that would be fine. At worst, he'd exhaust his mental power and magical power, absorb the surrounding pollution, and crawl out. But if Frem threw him into the abyssal eye? Saul looked at the warm-colored light sphere surrounding him and experimentally tested the magical power on it. Vast as the sea, when Saul's magical power probed into it, it seemed bottomless. Saul sighed inwardly and withdrew his probing magical power. Worthy of being a fourth-rank wizard. Saul was currently only third rank. Although his mental power had greatly increased due to achieving 3 Symphony of Fate targets, and his magical power had become purer compared to Frem, a fourth rank with hundreds of years of experience, he was still like a small sailboat on the ocean. Frem ultimately didn't throw Saul into the abyssal eye. The situation there was complex and dangerous. Even he rarely went there. Moreover, he currently still found Saul useful, just wanting to determine whether the other's ability could only protect himself or could protect an entire continent. If he could use this to find a method to completely eliminate the abyssal eye. Frem looked down at Saul. Even if this little fellow had Gorsa and the glare behind him, he didn't care. Chapter 879, Accidentally Guessing the Truth. Frem didn't throw Saul directly into the abyssal eye, but he also didn't plan to let Saul easily cope with this test. He brought Saul to the deep ocean where no one would normally approach, where even looking up, one could see an obvious depression on the horizon. "That's the abyssal eye," Frem told Saul. Saul laughed dryly. "You're not going to throw me in there, are you? You're still useful now. If you become useless, then I'll throw you in there." Having said this, the warm yellow light sphere exploded like a punctured balloon. Saul immediately began free-falling. Before he could start circulating magical power, he felt his spiritual body burn as if scorched by something. With no time for any resistance, he fell into the sea with a plop. This ocean was near the abyssal eye. Although the actual distance was still very far, the pollution concentration in the water was much deeper than during the Red Sea's black tide assault. More terrifying than the black tide that emerged from the storm eyes Saul had previously encountered. The only good news was that there were no anchor points in the seawater. So Saul's clothes were almost completely corroded the instant they touched the seawater. The defensive formations previously inscribed on his robes dissolved rapidly like paper. Massive pollution rushed toward him like wolves seeing sheep, pouring through every pore and inch of muscle on Saul's skin, entering his body to destroy, pollute, and aberrate. Saul's eyes snapped open in the water and both eyeballs immediately dissolved. His mouth stayed shut, but it was useless. His lips were rapidly dissolving too, revealing a row of eerie teeth. Soon, all of Saul's flesh and organs disappeared, leaving only a pitch-black skeleton sinking toward the seabed. Frem could still sense everything Saul was experiencing through the severely polluted seawater. He watched Saul become a skeleton missing its right arm, sinking silently, still not intervening. If Saul could only achieve this much, if he died here, Frem wouldn't feel it was any loss. Saul had originally prepared to deal with the pollution in the sea, but who knew Frem would directly destroy his defenses before throwing him down, determined to see how he would save himself after being polluted. Unable to defend himself immediately, Saul was naturally corroded into a skeleton by the terrible black tide pollution. Fortunately, this wasn't his first time in this form. Although his soul body was violently shaking and magical power was running wild uncontrollably in his body, he could still sense his consciousness remained clear. But clear consciousness meant the pain wasn't reduced at all. Saul endured the agony of his soul body, feeling like it was being kneaded on a nail board, gradually beginning to stabilize his mental power. Then he first took out the soul-fixing needle formation he had been studying these days, inscribing this complex formation within his soul body. Saul still hadn't completely analyzed this complex formation, but he had already extracted a simple prototype from it. Although it couldn't compare to the original soul-fixing needle formation, it still had some effect. But now Saul's magical power couldn't be directly channeled, and the magic crystals originally embedded in the metal nameplate had melted the instant they touched seawater. With his self-rescue plan blocked, Saul didn't panic. He raised his hand and took out another item from his storage device. It was the tear he had gotten from Mermaid Pearl. The moment he grasped the mermaid's tear, Saul felt like he was merging with the ocean, becoming part of the sea. Not only that, he felt the originally cold and turbulent seawater suddenly become obedient. Enduring his discomfort, Saul struggled to mobilize the usable parts of his mental power, urging the pearl to gather the surrounding seawater. Water elemental particles suddenly approached, squeezing out the pollution in the sea in a short time and wrapping around Saul. Saul immediately took advantage of this time to redirect his magical power and activate the soul-fixing formation in his hand. The formation circulated like iron nails being driven into Saul's brain, immediately making him dizzy and almost dropped the nameplate in his hand. The next second, Saul's eyes snapped open and the world suddenly paused. Several magic formations appeared around him again, so densely packed they almost completely blocked his figure. But Frim, watching Saul from the sea surface, was somewhat disappointed. They're all just methods for removing pollution and protecting the soul body. This is how you survive black tides. Frim didn't know that, although he was staring at Saul unblinkingly, the person's mind had long since left this place. Following the guidance of fate lines, amid the torment of black tide, Saul used the formations around him to carve out a passage for himself. The world before him changed from black and white to prismatic, with countless lines twisting and intertwining overhead. Saul felt himself also transform into a ball of thread like hemp rope. The pollution he had suffered in the seawater showed no signs of following him. He remained the smallest bundle of fate lines here. Seems you're not having an easy time in that world either, the death demon's voice rang out. If you don't like that world, you can cut the connection and return here anytime. It felt like a parent saying, if you don't want to work anymore, just come home, we'll support you. Thank you, but I don't want to come back with my tail between my legs. The other stopped speaking. Colors shifted and lines unfurled, as if everything was indifferent. In the prismatic world, time was no longer so urgent. Saul's thread ball kept rolling, thinking about how to respond next. Before long, he activated the prismatic channel and immediately contacted his 3 Symphony of Fate targets. Shea, I need to trouble you. Leave immediately for the borderland. Shea's listless voice came through. I'm currently a tree, so traveling is rather difficult. Saul frowned. Shea quickly continued, but I can separate a puppet. Although it can't do much if it's just delivering a message, that's possible. Saul just wanted Shea to deliver a message. Go to the borderland, to the Purity Wizard Tower, find a wizard named Kelly or Byron, and tell them it's time for Saul to return. All right, I'll try to get there within 10 days. Shea then remembered the rumors he had heard while hiding in tree roots these days. By the way, I heard your master Gorsa failed to advance to 4th rank wizard a few days ago. Saul was stunned. A few days ago. Advancement failure. Master Gorsa was a very proud person, but his strength matched his pride. Since he was already prepared to advance, how could he easily fail? Even the Glare family head had recognized him as the next family head, obviously very confident in his strength. How could such a Master Gorsa fail during advancement? Could there be some inside story? Could Frim's critical absence last time have been to sabotage Gorsa's advancement plan? But if his master's advancement failed, why didn't Frim look happier when he returned? Since Royer's resurrection, when Frim actively sought out Saul, he had carried a strange sense of urgency. Previously, Saul was just kept at the Evernight Royal Palace with an ostensible reason for helping. Now he was directly imprisoned in the maze corridor, and Frim had thrown him into Black Tide without explanation to observe how he resisted pollution. If Master Gorsa's advancement had failed, why was Frim still so unhappy? Could his plan not have been completely successful? Could it be he still wanted to kill Master Gorsa? Although the process in fact differed somewhat, Saul had accidentally guessed Frim's true purpose. Chapter 880, Black Bone Messenger. After talking with Shea, Saul felt his soul body becoming unstable. He should be returning soon. He quickly instructed Mido on several matters, and before he could greet Floco or settle scores with him, felt his soul grow weary and directly disconnected from the prismatic channel. Returning to the torturous ocean, Saul had consumed enormous mental power connecting to the prismatic world and was now completely exhausted, unable even to maintain the magic formations around him. To connect with the outside world, Saul hadn't focused all his attention on resisting pollution, leaving his current physical condition poor. But since he had returned from the prismatic world, Saul began consciously absorbing the pollution in the nearby seawater and swimming toward the surface. When he was in the Storm Eyes Black Tide before, he hadn't constantly soaked in pollution either. Whenever there was opportunity, he would immediately leave. Frim didn't stop Saul from surfacing. On the contrary, when Saul's black skeleton emerged from the water, he grabbed Saul and brought him back inside the light sphere. With the surrounding pollution gone and pressure suddenly reduced, Saul's mind relaxed and he fainted without any defense. Just now, due to Saul's movements, the already restless sea surface was stirred into giant waves again. But no matter how high the waves, they couldn't reach the warm-colored light sphere in the air. The light sphere quietly hovered in the sky for a moment. Special wizard body modification allows free transfer of pollution, relying on soul bodies far beyond normal humans to resist pollution's mental effects. So his ability to seal Storm Eyes alone relies on talent and body modification. A person's talent couldn't be changed, but wizard body modification. Frim looked at Saul's black skeleton body, his heart stirring with the desire to put him entirely on an experimental table. But thinking it over, he couldn't do something that killed the goose for its eggs. But if it's only this much, it's just barely self-preservation before black tides. What ability could he have to face the abyssal eye? The light sphere looked at the depression on the distant horizon. At this moment, the depression suddenly spouted a water column, followed by a strong pollution wave spreading in all directions. Even Frim had to retreat again to avoid it. Such an abyssal eye, Gorsa, where do you get the courage to want to go explore it? The light sphere didn't linger long before flashing and disappearing. Frim brought Saul back to the maze corridor and immediately left, but before leaving, he left potions and magic crystals for Saul to help him recover his body and spirit. After Frim left, Saul immediately sat up. He had only fainted briefly and awakened quickly, but remained restrained by Frim and was too lazy to wake up. Now that the person was gone, he immediately noticed the items on the ground and used them without ceremony. After all, even he didn't like being forcibly turned into a pile of bones. While Saul was treating himself, Frym had already left the maze corridor and come to the tribunal. Guarding outside were Leah and another wizard. Royer wasn't here. He was busy repairing the Red Sea trees, a very important task. He had to restore most of the Red Sea trees within 3 years and achieve over 80% coverage of Red Sea trees by Mido to resist black tide erosion of the continent as before. After Frym emerged, he first glanced at Leah. The beautiful second rank, which currently stood expressionlessly in place with her hands at her sides. Saul is currently severely polluted. Leah was startled, her eyes widening, but she still didn't look up. Go see if there's anywhere you're needed. Yes. Leah asked nothing else, walked forward 3 steps, then on the 4th step suddenly turned left. Her entire body seemed to enter a crevice and immediately disappeared. Only then did the other wizard speak. Chief, Leah seems overly concerned about Saul. It doesn't matter. Frym wasn't worried at all about what a second-rank wizard could do. Tell Yura to hurry up and act. The other wizard also withdrew. Not long after he left, a third wizard appeared. Lord Frym, the Glare Patriarch sent you a letter. Frym's light sphere directly swallowed the letter, which then self-ignited inside the sphere, leaving not even ashes behind. Inviting Saul as a guest, have they discovered I've imprisoned Saul? Frym said indifferently. We have important research. Let them wait. If it was just the Glare family, there was no need to pay too much attention. Anyway, as long as Gorsa died, he and the Glare family would definitely be enemies. So naturally, he needn't give them face now. Of course, if Gorsa didn't die and even advanced to 4th rank afterward, Frym would have quite a headache. No one knew whether Frym would have a headache in the future, but Kira was really having a headache now. She turned her head to look at her sister Yura sitting on the throne. The latter had somehow gained support from some force and directly detained her while controlling the entire Kema castle. Because the others' methods were extremely strong, people outside didn't even know that Kema Duchy had changed hands, with the true ruler changing from Grand Duke Kira to Yura. Although outwardly Kira was still the Grand Duke, she was actually no different from a prisoner. Most crucially, until now, Kira still didn't know what Yura wanted to do. She looked at Yura's face, clearly a very familiar visage, yet Kira didn't believe the other was her sister. Even though Gorsa said she was, and she herself claimed to be. But Kira always felt something was wrong. Her sister Yura should have been passionate about all kinds of knowledge, especially enjoying research into dark attributes and soul-related knowledge. But the current Yura was completely focused only on revenge. Even revenge against Gorsa, who had resurrected her. Yura knew Kira was staring at her but paid no attention. She had very important things to do now. Tell them to check once more. I won't listen to excuses. There can't be the slightest error. If I find any oversight, I'll make their heads grow out of their asses. Hey he he. Clearly speaking threatening, punishing words, but Yura seemed amused by herself and kept laughing alone. Several people knelt prostrate below the platform, finding nothing funny at all. They could only see sweat drops falling from their foreheads to the ground, leaving dark marks. Stop laughing, Kira sighed. The people kneeling on the ground had once been ministers she relied on, now toyed with by Yura like clowns. Being told this by the other, Yura's expression immediately turned ugly. She glanced at Kira. Did you write the letter I told you to write? Kira sighed inwardly. I wrote it and sent it out several days ago. Yura stood up from her seat. Then why hasn't he left the far north yet? When has Gorsa ever followed you and my commands? Knowing you're with me, he'll only hide further away, Kira said expressionlessly. Smack! Yura slapped the solid wood table, immediately creating a crack. He won't hide from me. But Yura also knew that, while Gorsa wouldn't hide from her, he might not come to see her either. That heartless man. Yura looked up, fire flickering in her eyes. He doesn't want to see me, but I'll make him come anyway. Hey, he he. Hearing Yura start making that strange laughing sound again, Kira frowned. Just then Kira saw Yura's laughter stop, but her lips still curved up eerily. She heard a sentence she couldn't understand. He'll come, as long as I say I have secrets about the dead wizard's diary here.